There is a man standing on an execution platform in a town called Town, and he is smiling. The blades are already crossed above his neck. The crowd has gone silent, and instead of begging for his life, he tells them the truth. His treasure is real. He left all of it in one place, and anyone who wants it is free to go and find it. Then he laughs, and the world he leaves behind spends the next 20-odd years tearing itself apart, trying to reach whatever he was talking about. That is where One Piece begins, or really where it begins again, and tonight we are going to move slowly through the whole of it, the seas and the fruits and the buried history and the strange quiet decisions of the man who has been drawing this story for almost 30 years. So settle in, get comfortable, turn the lights down low, and if you haven't subscribed to Mary yet, it genuinely does help us keep making these. Before any of the pirates, before the treasure, there was a man at a drawing desk who could not sleep. Eiichiro Oda decided he wanted to draw comics for a living when he was 4 years old, after reading a series called Kaibutsu-kun, and by the time he was a teenager, he was submitting work to Shueisha, the publisher behind Weekly Shonen Jump. He got his start the way a lot of manga artists do, as an assistant to someone more established, and in his case, that someone was Nobuhiro Watsuki, the creator of Rurouni Kenshin. Oda has said openly that Watsuki shaped him, and the clearest proof he has pointed to is smaller than you might expect. It is the bandana Roronoa Zoro wears, the same habit Watsuki had of tying one on whenever he hunched over his desk and lost himself completely in the work. The attitude, the swagger, the way a swordsman carries himself, a lot of that came out of that apprenticeship. What almost nobody outside the fandom knows is how many times One Piece was told no. The pirate story we now think of as unstoppable, the best-selling comic by a single author in the history of the medium, was rejected by Jump's editorial roughly 3 times before it ever ran. Oda had spent something like 2 years pitching manga that went nowhere, and the pirate concept, a one-shot he called Romance Dawn, was described by him as his last trump card, the thing he was going to try when nothing else had worked. If that pitch had failed the way the others did, there is a very real version of the last 3 decades of pop culture that simply does not contain this story at all. And here is the detail I find hardest to get my head around. When One Piece finally launched, in the 34th issue of Weekly Shonen Jump in the summer of 1997, with a first chapter titled Romance Dawn, Oda already knew how it ended. In an interview back in 1999, only a couple of years in, he said he had already decided the ending and drawn the final panel. He knew, from the very beginning, that the story would begin and end on a ship. Think about what that means for a work that is now well past 1100 chapters. Every reveal you have ever gasped at, every twist that felt like it rewired the whole world, was being steered toward a destination the author had already locked in before most of his readers were born. He also thought it would be quick. Oda originally planned to finish the whole thing in about 5 years. 5 years, he has said, in his own slightly bewildered way, that the characters started creating the story for him, that they took on lives and demands he had not anticipated, and that 5-year plan blew out into what is now approaching 30. The story got away from him in the best possible sense, growing side plots and nations and races and centuries of backstory that the original sketch never contained. The cost of that has been paid in sleep. For years, the documented account of Oda's working week has read like something close to self-harm. Story, dialogue, and the rough layout sketches, what the industry calls the name, filled Monday through Wednesday. Inking with his assistants ran Thursday through Saturday. Color work and cover art landed on Sunday. Inside that schedule, he was reportedly sleeping around 3 hours a night and almost never taking a full day off. There is a well-known account of his output described in exactly those terms, a man working as hard in his 50s as he did in his 20s, and it is part of why the fandom reacts the way it does whenever he takes a break. When Oda finally paused the manga for 4 weeks in the summer of 2023, it was to have surgery for astigmatism, and he joked that he had been drawing the final saga while effectively seeing double, watching twins of his own characters on the page. I want to spend a little time in the place most fans never look, which is the version of One Piece that almost existed. Because before the 1997 serialization, there were 2 prototype one-shots, both from 1996, both also called Romance Dawn, and they are strange to read now. In the first version, the female lead is not Nami. She is a girl named Silk. The world is far more grounded and ordinary. And the Gum Gum ability Luffy has is essentially the only special power in the whole setting. There is no haki. There is no vast system of devil fruits. The villain is a forgettable captain called Crescent Moon Galley. Silk was reworked into a character named Anne, and Anne was eventually reworked into Nami, so the navigator we know went through 2 complete identities before she settled. The second prototype is even stranger, and it contains the single fact from this era I most want you to hold on to. In that version, Luffy receives both his straw hat and his devil fruit, not from Shanks and not by chance, but from his grandfather, and his grandfather is a pirate. Oda has since admitted he was, in his words, dead set on Shanks the whole time, but deliberately kept him out of the one-shots and used a stand-in grandfather instead. When the real serialization came, he took that pirate grandfather idea and turned it completely inside out, because Luffy's grandfather, in the actual story, is Monkey D. Garp, a Marine, a legendary Navy officer, the sworn enemy of the very life Luffy chooses. The mentor figure who gives the boy his dream became, in the final version, the authority figure trying to beat that dream out of him. That inversion, from pirate grandfather to Marine grandfather, is one of the cleanest examples I know of how Oda works, taking a straightforward idea and folding it against itself until it has tension. That second one-shot even had a loose thread that got cut entirely. Anne had a pet called Balloon, an animal hunted for its magical blood, a whole plot hook that simply never made it into the finished manga. It is a small thing, but it tells you how much raw material was left on the floor. The character rework I find most delicious, though, involves Zoro, because the calm, loyal swordsman who would follow Luffy into hell was originally sketched as a villain. In Oda's early conception, Zoro was a bodyguard in the crew of Buggy the Clown, and his three-sword style was a circus gimmick, a performing strongman's trick rather than a discipline. Buggy's group was written almost like a family, with Zoro cast as a kind of elder brother figure inside it. When Oda pulled Zoro out and made him a hero, he kept a few of the villainous design cues on purpose: the bandana, the heavy swords, the hard stare, so that the first time you meet him he still reads as dangerous, as someone who could just as easily be an enemy. That ambiguity was a leftover from the draft where he actually was one. None of this fossilized. The story kept improvising even after it was a runaway hit, which is a thing people forget about long-running serialized fiction. It is not a finished novel released in order. It is a weekly high-wire act. There is a well-documented account that 9 of the rookie pirates who would round out the group known as the Supernovas, a lineup that would go on to shape the entire back half of the story, were sketched out by Oda in roughly 3 hours, after his editor complained that the Sabati Archipelago arc was not interesting enough, with Luffy and Zoro already in place to complete the 11. He drew this cluster of future emperors and captains as a quick fix, and by his own account he expected around half of them to simply drop out of relevance once they entered the new world, to vanish the way most side characters do. Instead, they became load-bearing pillars of everything that followed. We will come back to them later, because the fact that they were improvised in an afternoon is genuinely one of the more astonishing things about how this world was built. But I mention it here because it belongs to the same truth as the Romance Dawn prototypes. The sturdiest-looking architecture in One Piece was often a fast decision that got lucky and then got load-tested for 20 years. So that is the ground we are standing on tonight. A story that was rejected until it was somebody's last resort, whose ending was written before its beginning was popular, drawn by a man on 3 hours of sleep who thought he would be done in 5 years, and whose most famous characters are, several of them, salvaged from drafts where they were completely different people. Everything from here builds on that foundation. So let us start where the story itself starts, with a dead man's promise and the era it created. The dead man on the scaffold has a name the Marines refuse to say correctly. They call him Gold Roger. His actual name is Gol D. Roger, and that quiet initial buried in the middle of it turns out to be one of the deepest threads in the entire story. But we will get to the letter D later, because it deserves its own long stretch. For now, what matters is what Roger was. He was the Pirate King, and that title is not a boast or a bounty ranking. It is a literal statement of fact. Roger is the only man in the history of the world who sailed the entire Grand Line from one end to the other and reached the final island, a place his crew named Laugh Tale, where the treasure called the One Piece is said to wait. He did what no one else has done, and then, Rather than dying at sea or being hunted down, he did something stranger. He was dying anyway, of an incurable illness, and he chose to turn himself in. He walked into his own execution. The Marines wanted his death to be a warning. They staged it publicly in his hometown, to show the world what happens to pirates, to close the book on the age of piracy by killing the greatest pirate who ever lived, in the open, in front of everyone. It backfired completely. Roger used his last words to tell the crowd that his treasure was real, and out there for the taking, and the effect of a condemned man laughing about wealth beyond imagining was not fear, it was hunger. Thousands of people set sail. What the world government intended as an ending became the starting gun for what the story calls the Great Age of Pirates, and everything that happens across the next 1100 episodes is downstream of that single miscalculation. They tried to bury the dream, and instead, they broadcast it. Now, the real world has a very close echo of this scene, and it is one of my favorite pieces of behind-the-glass trivia in the whole franchise. There was an actual pirate named Olivier Levasseur, nicknamed La Bouse, the Buzzard, who was hanged in the early 1700s. The persistent legend around his execution is that as he stood on the scaffold, he flung a cryptogram, a coded message said to be around 17 lines long, into the crowd, and shouted something to the effect of, "Find my treasure, whoever can." Fans and several outlets have traced Roger's execution speech directly back to that story, and the resemblance is hard to miss. A condemned pirate turning his own death into a treasure hunt that outlives him. I want to be careful here, because Oda has never officially confirmed that Levasseur was the source, so treat it as a very strong likeness rather than a stated fact. But once you know the Buzzard threw his fortune to a crowd from the gallows, you cannot unsee it in Roger. Roger is also the reason to talk about the event that shaped the entire generation of monsters ruling the seas today, an event the story kept almost entirely off-screen for years and has only recently begun to fully explain. Roughly 38 years before the present of the story, on an island called God Valley, there was a crew so dangerous that the world government still treats its existence as something close to classified. They were the Rocks Pirates, led by a man named Rox D. Zebek, and their goal was not treasure or freedom. It was to become king of the world, to tear the world government's order down and rule what remained. What makes the Rocks Pirates almost unbelievable is the roster. Among Zebek's crew were 3 people who would each, later, become emperors of the sea in their own right. Edward Newgate, who the world would come to know as Whitebeard, Kaido, who would be called the strongest creature alive, and Charlotte Linlin, who would become Big Mom. These were not allies. They were future rivals serving under one captain, and that captain was ambitious enough to hold them all in the same crew at the same time. The Rocks Pirates were destroyed at God Valley by an alliance no one expected, because the 2 men who joined forces to bring them down were themselves supposed to be enemies. One was the young Gol D. Roger, a rising pirate. The other was Monkey D. Garp, the Marine, the man who would later corner Roger himself. A pirate and a Navy hero fought side by side exactly once against a threat frightening enough to make that partnership worth it, and Zebek died there. This is the God Valley incident, and its consequences never stopped rippling. It is why Garp is a living legend. It is where a young child named Shanks was found. And in the last couple of years, the manga has been steadily expanding what actually happened on that island. So I will hold to the load-bearing beats, that Roger and Garp brought down Zebek, and that 3 future emperors walked away from it alive, and leave the freshest details soft, because that part of the history is being actively rewritten as we speak. There is a strange timeline wrinkle hiding in all of this that fans have argued about for years, and it is worth naming because it is the kind of thing a careful viewer notices. Blackbeard, the future Emperor Marshall D. Teach, has had his age stated as around 40. If God Valley happened roughly 38 years ago, that would make Blackbeard barely 2 years old at the time, which has fueled a long-running debate about whether he was somehow present or connected to that event far earlier than seems possible. I mention it not to resolve it, because it is not resolved, but because it is a real inconsistency baked into the numbers, and part of enjoying a story this long is watching the seams where the arithmetic strains. Let me pull back to the biggest question the whole series dangles, which is the one hiding in the title. What is the One Piece? For nearly 30 years, people have theorized, and the theories tend to drift toward the abstract and the sentimental. Maybe the treasure is not gold at all. Maybe it is the friendships made along the way, or love, or the journey itself. Some warm, intangible thing that makes the long voyage worth it. It is a comforting idea, and Oda has shot it down about as bluntly as an author can. Asked directly whether the One Piece might be something abstract like that, he said no, he hates that kind of thing. Those are close to his exact words as they have been reported, that he hates the idea of the treasure being a metaphor for friendship. He has consistently framed the One Piece as a real, physical treasure, something that actually exists at the end of the Grand Line, something Roger physically found and laughed at. Whatever it is a thing you could hold. That matters more than it might seem, because it changes how you read the whole story. If the treasure were just a symbol, the voyage would be a fable about the value of the trip. Oda is telling you it is not. There is a real object at the center of this, real enough that empires have been built and drowned chasing it, real enough that a dying man thought it was worth turning the world upside down just to point at it. We do not know what it is. Roger's crew found it, and their reaction was to laugh, and that laughter is the reason the final island is called Laugh Tale, rather than the long-assumed Raftel. But the treasure is a thing, and the story has promised, through the mouth of its author, that we will eventually be shown it. So the premise, stripped to its bones, is this. A man reached the end of the world and found something real. He came back, said so with a smile as he died, and the whole planet went to sea. One crew, a young pirate named Monkey D. Luffy, and the friends he gathers, is trying to follow that same path to the end, and everyone else, the Navy, the government, the other emperors, is trying to either stop them or beat them to it. Everything else, the powers and the factions and the buried centuries, is the texture of the world that Promise created. And the first thing you have to understand about that world is its shape, because the ocean Luffy is sailing is nothing like ours. Picture a planet that is almost entirely water. There is only one continent, and it does not sprawl the way ours do. It is a single, unbroken band of red rock called the Red Line, and it runs all the way around the globe from pole to pole, a ring of stones circling the whole world. Cutting across that ring, at a right angle, is a second band, but this one is not land. It is a sea route, a belt of ocean that also wraps the entire planet, and it is called the Grand Line. So you have two great rings crossing each other, one of rock and one of treacherous sea, and where they intersect, they divide all the rest of the ocean into 4 separate seas. The North Blue, the East Blue, the South Blue, and the West Blue. 4 oceans, each with its own culture, its own history, its own reputation, and a young pirate from a small village in one of the quieter corners of the East Blue is where our story happens to start. The Grand Line is the spine of everything. It is where the treasure is, where the strongest pirates gather, where the final island sits, and it has a nickname that tells you everything about it, the Pirate's Graveyard. It earns that name because the ordinary rules of the sea simply stop working there. The islands have their own magnetic fields. The weather can flip from sunshine to a killing storm in the space of a minute, and a normal compass spins uselessly. To navigate it at all, you need a special instrument called a log pose, which locks onto the magnetic field of one island and slowly recharges toward the next, so that crossing the Grand Line means island hopping along an invisible magnetic thread, unable to simply chart a straight course. Get it wrong and the sea swallows you. That is not a metaphor. Whole crews vanish there. Bordering the Grand Line, above and below it, are 2 stretches of ocean called the Calm Belt, and they are terrifying in a completely opposite way. There is no wind, no waves, no current at all. A sailing ship becomes dead in the water, unable to move, and that stillness is not peaceful, because the Calm Belt is the breeding ground of the Sea Kings, colossal sea monsters large enough to swallow a galleon whole. So the Grand Line is fenced on both sides by bands of motionless water full of leviathans, which is why almost no one crosses into it that way. The Marines manage it because their ships are lined with a special substance we will talk about later that lets them slip through, but for everyone else there is really only one door. That door is a mountain. To enter the Grand Line the ordinary way, a ship sails to a place called Reverse Mountain, where the ocean currents of all 4 blues flow upward, against gravity, up the slope of the mountain, over the top, and back down the other side into the Grand Line. You literally ride a river up a mountain to get in. It is the kind of image that sounds like a child's drawing, until you see how seriously the story takes its own physics. and it is a good early sign that this world runs on rules, strange rules, but consistent ones. The Grand Line itself is split into two halves by the red line crossing it. The first half, from Reverse Mountain up to the Great Continent, is called Paradise, which is a bitterly ironic name because it is the gentler half, and it still kills most people who enter it. The second half, on the far side of the red line, is called the New World, and that is where the real monsters live, the emperors and their territories, and it ends at the last island, Laugh Tale. Getting from Paradise into the New World means passing the red line, and beneath the red line, 10,000 meters down at the bottom of the sea, there is an entire civilization living in the dark. Fishman Island, lit by a gigantic glowing tree, home to the fishmen and the merfolk. A whole people with their own long and painful history this video circles back to later. The idea that you sail down through the ocean, past crushing depth, to a kingdom under the world's only continent, is the sort of geography most stories would build a whole series around. Here it is, one stop on a very long road. What I love about this world, and what I think a lot of casual viewers miss, is how much of it is built on real places, carefully and deliberately. Oda has a documented habit of modeling his islands on actual locations, and once you know the references, the map becomes a kind of travelogue. The desert kingdom of Alabasta is ancient Egypt, sand and pyramids and a royal family. The shipwright city of Water 7, with its canals and its water taxis and its sinking streets, is Venice, which Oda confirmed directly in one of his question and answer columns. Dressrosa, the passionate, flower-strewn kingdom of dolls and bullfighting, is Spain, and more specifically, its winding architecture draws on Barcelona and the mosaic curves of Park Güell, which he also confirmed. The samurai country of Wano is Edo period Japan, and its layout was drawn to resemble a real castle, Azuchi Castle. Even the sky, when the story climbs into it, has a real anchor, because the lost golden city of Shandora up in Skypiea was modeled on the Maya ruins of Tikal, the stepped stone pyramids rising out of the jungle, and the enormous elephant that carries an entire country on its back, Zunesha, draws on the Hindu myth of the world elephant, the beast that holds up the earth. Which brings me to a piece of trivia I think about far too often, because it is the perfect example of the kind of joke Oda buries where almost no one will dig it up. That giant elephant, Zunesha, has a species name, and he only revealed it in a bonus column tucked into the volume numbered 83. He called it the Naitamia norida elephant. It sounds like nonsense, some invented zoological Latin, but read it backwards, and it resolves into a sentence. It means, roughly, an elephant that looks like a Dali painting. He named the creature after Salvador Dali, the surrealist, and specifically after Dali's famous images of elephants standing on absurdly long, spindly, insect-thin legs, which is exactly how Zunesha is drawn, a mountain of an animal balanced on impossibly slender limbs. He hid a Salvador Dali reference inside a backwards anagram inside a species name that appears in a bonus column. That is the level of detail we are dealing with, and it is not the only backwards word on the map, because the land of the giants that the crew reaches in the current saga, Elbaf, is simply the word fable spelled backwards. A nation of giants out of storybook myth, named by reversing the word for a story. Once you see it, you cannot look at the name the same way. The reason all of this geography matters, and is not just set dressing, is that the shape of the world is the engine of the plot. Because there is only one continent, and it circles the globe, whoever controls the top of that continent controls a choke point the entire world has to route around. Because the Grand Line is nearly impossible to navigate without specific knowledge and instruments, information becomes as valuable as strength. Because the final island can only be reached by crossing the deadliest sea on the planet from beginning to end, the people who have done it can be counted on almost no fingers. The map is not a backdrop that the characters move across. It is the thing they are fighting over. Control of the seas, control of the one road, control of the knowledge that lets you read the road at all. The world's geography is a set of locked doors, and the whole story is about who holds which keys. And the strangest key of all is not a map or a ship or an instrument. It is a piece of fruit that gives a person power and takes something away in exchange, and the rules around it are so specific, so consistent, and so occasionally broken on purpose that they are worth slowing all the way down for. They are called devil fruits, and the bargain they offer is the same every time. Eat one, and you gain an ability no ordinary person could have. In exchange, the sea rejects you forever. A devil fruit user can never swim again. This is the central rule of the entire power system, and the story treats it as absolute. Submerge a devil fruit user in water, and the strength drains straight out of them, leaving them limp and helpless. And this is true whether they are the weakest pickpocket or the strongest emperor on the seas. Luffy, the protagonist, the future king of the pirates, sinks like a stone if he falls off his own ship. It is the great vulnerability threaded through the whole cast, and it is why so many fights happen near water, and why so many desperate escapes hinge on someone who cannot swim being fished out at the last second. The story is unusually precise about how the weakness works, and this is one of those places where Oda answered a fan question and quietly locked the rule down tighter than the manga ever had to. In a reader question column at the back of volume 41, he explained that a user is only truly immobilized when at least half of their body is submerged. Dip a hand or a foot in, and they can still move and fight. Rain has no effect at all. It is only when the sea truly takes hold of them, half the body or more under the surface, that the power switches off. That is why you will see a devil fruit user stand in shallow water and be fine, then be reduced to a rag doll the moment they go under. It is a rule with a threshold, not a switch, and knowing it makes a surprising number of fight scenes read differently. There is a second way to trigger that same weakness, and it is a substance the Marines use everywhere. It is called sea stone, and it is essentially the sea rendered solid. Handcuffs made of it, cannonballs, the linings of warships, all of it produces the same draining effect as the ocean itself. Chain a devil fruit user in sea stone, and they are as powerless as if they were drowning. This is how a world full of superhuman pirates can still be policed at all, because the government has a material that turns off superpowers on contact, and it is why the deadliest prisoners are kept in sea stone cages, and why the Marines can cross the calm belt in ships that would otherwise be helpless. The fruits come in three broad kinds. The commonest are the paramecia, which grant some superhuman quality to the body or the world around it, powers that do not fit neatly into any other box. Then there are the zoan fruits, which let a person transform into an animal and into a half-human hybrid of that animal, and these have a peculiar wrinkle, because a zoan fruit is said to have a will of its own, a kind of animal spirit inside it. And then, rarest and generally considered strongest, the logia, which let a person become an element. A logia user does not merely control fire or lightning or smoke or magma. They turn into it, so that a punch passes harmlessly through a body made of flame. Fighting a logia user with ordinary attacks is close to useless, because there is nothing solid to hit, and for a long time in the story, a logia power looked like something close to invincibility, which is where the rules start getting bent on purpose. There is exactly one man in the world who carries 2 devil fruits, and the story goes out of its way to tell you that this should be impossible. Eating a second devil fruit is supposed to kill you. The body cannot hold 2, and the described result is that it bursts. Every character who talks about it treats it as a law of nature. And then there is Marshall D. Teach, Blackbeard, who wields 2 at once, a Logia darkness power and a Paramecia quake power, the second of which he took from Whitebeard's corpse. The manga does not fully explain how he survives it. The closest thing to an answer comes from one of Whitebeard's own commanders, who says that Blackbeard's body is abnormal, unusual in some fundamental structural way that lets him do what would kill anyone else. Recent story developments have tied that abnormality to his heritage, but the honest state of it is that the mechanism is still officially unexplained. He is the exception that the rule was written to make frightening, a man who broke a law of the world and lived. There is also a lovely little contradiction sitting inside the crew itself, and I bring it up because only a devoted rewatcher tends to catch it. Sanji, the cook, is at one point shown not to know that Luffy cannot swim, which is a fairly basic fact about devil fruit users. Yet later in the series he claims that a book he read as a child made him something of an expert on devil fruits. Both cannot be quite true, and it is one of several small snags that come from writing a story across 3 decades without a Bible you can perfectly hold in your head. I do not point it out to complain. I point it out because a world this large staying as coherent as it does is the real achievement, and the tiny seams are almost reassuring, proof that a human being running on almost no sleep is doing this, and not a machine. And Sanji gives us the sweetest, long-delayed payoff in the whole system too. Back on Thriller Bark, Years and years ago in story time, there is a moment where he loses his temper about a specific devil fruit, the one that grants invisibility, because it had fallen into the hands of a man using it to peep on women. Sanji rages that invisibility is the exact power he would have wanted, the one he most desired, wasted on a pervert. It plays as a throwaway comedy beat. Then, something like 10 years later in real publishing time, Sanji is given a special combat suit by his estranged family, and one of its abilities, called Stealth Black, is invisibility. The power he screamed about wanting, cast off as a joke, came back a decade later and was handed to him for real. Oda planted a punchline and let it sit for 10 years before he paid it off. The second great power system is quieter and, in some ways, more important. Because unlike devil fruits, it does not require eating anything, and it is available, in principle, to anyone with the will for it. It is called haki, and it is a kind of spiritual energy, an expression of a person's willpower made real. There are 3 forms. The first is observation haki, a sixth sense that lets a user feel the presence, the emotions, even the intentions of people around them. And in its advanced form it edges into something like precognition, a brief glimpse of an opponent's next move before it happens. The second is armament haki, which lets a user coat their body or their weapon in an invisible armor of willpower, hardening their attacks and their defenses, and crucially, it is the counter to those seemingly untouchable Logia users, because haki-infused strikes can hit the intangible body that ordinary attacks pass through. That single rule is what keeps the Logia from breaking the entire story, because it means even a man made of fire can be hurt by someone whose will is strong enough. The third form is the rarest and the one I find most interesting, because it cannot be learned. It is called Conqueror's Haki, and unlike the other two, it cannot be trained into existence. You either have it or you do not, and it is said to appear in something like 1 person in a million. It is the Haki of Kings, the ability to press your will down onto everyone around you so hard that the weaker-minded simply collapse, knocked unconscious by the sheer force of another person's spirit. An existing user can refine it, sharpen it, learn to coat their attacks with it for enormous power, which is a development the story leaned into heavily during the samurai arc. But it cannot be created where it does not already live. It is a gift of the soul, distributed almost at random, and it tends to mark the people the story considers destined for something, which is a faintly fatalistic idea for a series so obsessed with freedom. Even the mundane details of these characters are mapped out to a degree that borders on obsessive, and my favorite example lives at the intersection of the power system and pure trivia. Oda gave the One Piece world its own blood type system, invented letters rather than the usual ones, so that what we would call Type A is written as an X, Type B as an F, and so on. And within that system, Sanji has been assigned the blood type stated to be the rarest in the entire One Piece world, a type shared by not a single one of his crewmates. It means nothing to the plot. It is just a fact Oda decided was true, filed away in a bonus column, part of the enormous invisible scaffolding under a story that only ever shows you a fraction of what its author has actually worked out. All of these powers, though, sit on top of something older and darker, a history the people wielding them mostly do not know. Because the world has a hole in it, a century that has been deliberately erased, and the fight over what happened during those 100 years is the true engine underneath the treasure hunt. The world's official history has a gap in it, and the gap is exactly 100 years long. It sits roughly 800 years in the past, and it is called the Void Century. And the reason it is a void is not that the records were lost, it is that the records were destroyed on purpose. The world government has forbidden the study of that century so completely that researching it is a crime punishable by death, and it has spent 8 centuries hunting down anyone who tries. Whatever happened in those 100 years, the people who built the current order do not want it known, and they were willing to erase an entire island of scholars to keep it buried. So when you ask what the great mystery of One Piece really is, it is not the treasure, it is this. What happened during the century no one is allowed to remember. Here is what the story has let us piece together, carefully, because a lot of it is delivered through characters who themselves only half understand it. 800 years ago, there existed an advanced kingdom, sometimes called the Ancient Kingdom or the Great Kingdom, and it was destroyed at the end of the Void Century by an alliance of 20 other kingdoms. Those 20 victorious kingdoms went on to found the world government, and the descendants of their kings became the ruling class of the entire world. So the government that rules the present was born out of the destruction of that ancient kingdom, which means the Forbidden Century is, in a real sense, the story of how the current rulers came to power, and why they would rather no one ever read the full account. But the ancient kingdom did something before it fell. Seeing its own defeat coming, it carved its true history into indestructible stone, blocks of a black rock that cannot be broken, and it scattered them across the world so that the truth would survive, even if the kingdom did not. These are the poneglyphs, and they are written in a script that almost no one alive can read. The stones were invented, according to the story, by a family from Wano, the Kozuki, roughly 800 years ago, and only the Kozuki bloodline was ever meant to read and carve that ancient writing, which tells you immediately why the Kozuki have been hunted so relentlessly. They are the keepers of the alphabet the whole conspiracy depends on hiding. The poneglyphs come in kinds. Some record history, the true account of the void century. Some, the red ones, called road poneglyphs, are more practical, because there are 4 of them, and each gives a single coordinate, and only by gathering the rubbings of all 4 and overlaying them can you find the point where their lines cross, which is the location of the final island. And a few are instructional, describing how to build the ancient weapons that could destroy the world. The important thing to hold on to is that there is no shortcut. You cannot simply steal a treasure map. To reach Laugh-Tale, you need all 4 road poneglyphs, and to understand what you find, you need someone who can read the ancient script, and the government has spent 800 years making sure both of those things are as rare as possible. There is exactly one person known to be alive who can read the poneglyphs, and she sails with the main crew. Her name is Nika Robin, and she is the last survivor of an island called Ohara, whose scholars were wiped out for the crime of researching this very history. I will come to what happened to Ohara, because it is one of the cruelest things the series ever shows, and it deserves to be told properly, rather than in passing. For now, what matters is the shape of it. Robin can read the stones. The government knows she can. That is the entire reason she is one of the world's most wanted people, hunted since she was a child, because a single literate archaeologist is a threat to a lie, 800 years in the maintenance. Threaded through all of this is a single letter, and I promised earlier we would come back to it. A number of characters carry an initial in their names that seems to serve no purpose. Monkey D. Luffy, Gol D. Roger, Portgas D. Ace, Marshall D. Teach, Monkey D. Garp, Monkey D. Dragon, Trafalgar D. Waterlaw. That middle D is passed down, generation to generation, and the story calls it the Will of D. The people who carry it tend to share strange traits. They are framed, again and again, as the natural enemies of the world's gods, the enemies of the celestial dragons who rule from the Holy Land, and they have a habit that the story returns to over and over, which is that they smile in the face of death. Roger laughed on the scaffold. Others have grinned as they died. The world government fears the D so much that it has tried to erase even the knowledge that the letter means anything. The honest part is this. After nearly 30 years, the literal meaning of the D has still not been revealed. We know the traits. We know the fear. We do not know what it stands for, and anyone who tells you they do with certainty is guessing. I find the way this lore was planted more impressive than the lore itself, because Oda seeds these things absurdly far in advance. Take the name Joy Boy, which has become one of the central figures of the entire final stretch of the story. Joy Boy was a person who lived during the Void Century, a figure Roger himself felt he had been born too early to meet, and in the current saga he has become tied to the deepest mysteries of the world. But that name was not introduced recently. It first appears in chapter 628, in an apology written on a poneglyph deep beneath the waves, an ancient promise Joy Boy made to the fishmen and failed to keep. That was hundreds of chapters before the payoff. Oda dropped the name of a figure who would eventually reshape the entire meaning of the series, tucked it into a single stone at the bottom of the ocean, and let it sit for years before anyone understood its weight. The clearest example of this long game, though, is a side story most people skip. Oda has a habit of running small illustrated serials in the corners of his title pages, little ongoing side adventures told a few panels at a time, and the fandom tends to treat them as canon minor continuity, which they are. One of them followed the Sky Island villain Enel after his own arc ended, on a journey he took to the moon. It was played as a whimsical epilogue, a defeated god wandering off to explore. But the murals Enel discovers up there, ancient paintings on the walls of a dead moon city, show something enormous. They depict the ancestors of the sky peoples originating on the moon and leaving it when its resources ran dry, migrating down to the blue planet below, leaving behind mechanical automata. That side serial, tucked into the margins of the pages, quietly established that there is a whole prehistory to this world involving the moon, a history that the main story would not seriously return to for many years, until the science and the revelations of the final saga began pulling those threads back in. Oda foreshadowed the ancient kingdom and the deep past of his world in a comedic footnote years before the payoff, and trusted that the readers who cared would remember. That is the quiet promise underneath the whole series, that it is all connected, that the joke in the margin and the tragedy at the center are part of one design, and that a name dropped in passing 500 chapters ago is going to matter. The void century is the black hole all of it circles. And to understand why the truth is buried so violently, you have to look at the people doing the burying, the ones who sit at the very top of the world, above the marines, above the kings, above even the council that everyone assumes is in charge. The world government presents itself as a coalition, more than 170 member nations bound together under one banner, and at first glance it looks like the closest thing this world has to civilization, the force of law against the chaos of piracy. But the deeper you go, the clearer it becomes that the government is not the hero of this story. It is the antagonist, wearing the robes of order. And nowhere is that clearer than in the class of people who sit at the top of it, the descendants of those 20 founding kings, who are called the world nobles, or the celestial dragons. The celestial dragons live in the holy land of Marejwa, a city built at the very top of the red line, above the clouds, above the ordinary world in a literal sense. And they are among the vilest characters Oda has ever drawn, deliberately so. They wear bubble helmets over their heads, sealed glass domes, so that they never have to breathe the same air as common people, whom they regard as a lower species. They own slaves openly, branded with a mark, and it is entirely legal, because a celestial dragon can do essentially anything to anyone below them, with no consequence at all. They can shoot a commoner in the street for the crime of standing too close, and if anyone dares to strike one of them, the punishment is not a trial, it is an admiral, one of the Navy's absolute top-tier warriors, dispatched to annihilate whoever did it. When Luffy, early in the post-timeskip story, punches one of these nobles in the face for what he does to a friend, it summons exactly that response, the highest level of military force the world can field, because harming a celestial dragon is treated as a greater crime than almost any act of piracy. Above even the nobles sits a council, the 5 highest-ranking figures in the entire government, long known simply as the 5 Elders. For most of the series they appeared to be the ultimate authority, 5 grim old men making the decisions no one else could, and the recent story has revealed them to be far stranger than that, capable of monstrous transformations and seemingly beyond ordinary death. But the single biggest reveal of the modern era of One Piece is that even the 5 elders are not the top. There is someone above them. In the deepest chamber of Marejwa there is an empty throne, a seat that the whole world has been told, for 800 years, that no one sits in, a symbol that no single person rules the world, and that is a lie. Someone does sit there. Its name is Imu, and Imu is the true and hidden ruler of the entire world, a figure the 5 elders themselves bow to, a being of apparently ageless life who has been steering the government from behind that empty throne since the beginning. What Imu is capable of is genuinely chilling, and the story demonstrated it rather than just describing it. There is a small kingdom called Lulusia, and at a certain point in the recent story, as a display of the government's power and its willingness to use it, most of that kingdom is simply erased. Not conquered, not bombarded in the ordinary sense. Wiped off the map by a power wielded from Marejwa, a nation and its people deleted from existence in a matter of moments. It is the moment the scale of the threat clicks into place, because it means the ultimate villain of this pirate adventure is not a stronger pirate. It is a hidden god emperor who can delete a country from the world, and who has been doing quiet, unspeakable things to protect a secret for 8 centuries. Now, I want to give you one of the eeriest small pieces of trivia in the entire franchise, because it lives right here, in the erased kingdom of Lulusia, and it involves a running joke that most fans have laughed at for years without realizing it had a dark edge. There is a background character in One Piece named Panda Man, a man with the head of a panda, and he is a hidden object gag. Oda smuggles him into crowd scenes, into wanted posters, into random backgrounds across hundreds and hundreds of chapters, a Where's the Panda game the fandom has played for decades. Here is what almost no one knows. Panda Man was not even created for One Piece. Oda designed him back in 1998 for a tribute contest connected to another manga, Kinnikuman, before he started hiding him in his own work, and his first actual cameo in the One Piece manga is not in Chapter 1, as people often assume, but much later, in Chapter 44. Over the years, he has appeared in the background hundreds of times, in nearly every location the story visits, and the one place, the single documented location, that Panda Man is completely absent from, is the Lulusia Kingdom, the kingdom that got erased. Whether Oda did that deliberately or not, the effect is unbearable once you know it. The one crowd he is not hiding in is the crowd that was deleted from the world. A decades-old visual joke became a quiet gravestone. The people who challenge all of this are scattered, and one faction exists specifically to tear the celestial dragons down. It is called the Revolutionary Army, and it is led by a man named Monkey D. Dragon, who happens to be the most wanted man in the entire world, officially the worst criminal alive, and who also happens to be Luffy's father. The relationship is one of the story's great quiet ironies. The king of the pirates in the making is the son of the man trying to overthrow the government, and the grandson of the Navy legend who upholds it. 3 generations of one family, each one at a different point of the war between freedom and order. Dragon's second in command, his chief of staff, is a young man named Sabo, and Sabo carries an even heavier connection to Luffy that we will come to when we talk about the 3 brothers. The government's grip tightened, and then it slipped, at a great political summit that the story built toward for years. A gathering of some 50 kings from across the world held once every 4 years at Marjoie, called the Levely, or the Reverie. The latest one produced enormous shocks. It was where the system of government-sanctioned pirates was abolished, a decision we will get into shortly. It was where the crackdown on the remaining sanctioned pirates was ordered, and it was where 2 kings, pushing for change, ran headlong into the thing that actually rules the world. One of those kings was Nefertari Cobra, the ruler of the desert kingdom of Alabasta, a good man, the father of a princess the crew had fought and bled for. During the summit, Cobra asked a question he was not supposed to ask, about the empty throne and the true history, and for the crime of learning too much, he was killed, at or by the order of Imu. And then the government did something cold and characteristic. It framed the revolutionary Sabo for the murder, broadcasting his face to the world as a king killer, turning a political assassination into propaganda. The reveal folded into Cobra's death is one that reframes a character we had known since almost the beginning of the series. The Nefertari family, Cobra's line, the royal family of Alabasta, turns out to be of the D clan. Their full ancestral name includes it, Nefertari D. Lily, an ancient queen who was one of the 20 rulers who founded the world 800 years ago, and who did something none of the others did. She refused to move to Mariejois. She would not join the celestial dragons in their holy city, would not become one of the world's gods, and that refusal, the story implies, is bound up with why the D clan came to be branded the natural enemies of those gods in the first place. The Nefertari are the one founding royal family out of 20 that chose to stay among ordinary people, and they have been quietly paying for that choice ever since. Princess Vivi, Cobra's daughter, vanished during the fallout of the summit, spirited away to safety, her fate left as one of the open threads the story is still holding. So that is the top of the world, an empty throne that is not empty, a hidden ruler who can erase nations, a council of transformed elders who answer to it, a class of masked aristocrats who own human beings for sport, and a scattered resistance led by the protagonist's own father. It is a bleak architecture, and the story does not flinch from it. But the government is not unopposed on the open sea, because out there, in the deadly second half of the Grand Line, power is held by a handful of pirates so strong that even the Navy treats them as its equals, and the makeup of that group has changed more than most viewers realize. They are called the Four Emperors, the Yonko, and they are the four most powerful and notorious pirates alive, each ruling a slice of the New World like a warlord king, each strong enough that the world government treats them as one of the great powers holding the balance of the world in place. For most of the series, if you asked a fan to name the four emperors, you would get the same four names: Whitebeard, Edward Newgate, the strongest man in the world; Kaido, called the strongest creature in the world; Big Mom, Charlotte Linlin; and Shanks, the red-haired pirate who gave Luffy his hat. That was the lineup that defined the middle stretch of the story. Four titans none of the heroes could touch. Here is the thing: a lot of people who fell off the anime years ago do not know. That lineup is gone. Whitebeard died. Kaido and Big Mom were both defeated. And the current four emperors, as of the latest state of the story, are a very different group. Shanks is still there. Blackbeard, Marshall D. Teach, took a seat after the war we will talk about. And the two newest emperors are, of all people, Monkey D. Luffy himself, who rose to that rank after his victory in the samurai country, and Buggy. Yes, that Buggy, the clown pirate the crew beat back in the very first arc of the entire series. A small-time crook whose main talent is splitting his body into floating pieces. Buggy became one of the four emperors, the four most feared pirates in the world, entirely by accident, through a series of misunderstandings and inflated reputation, ending up as the figurehead of an organization far more dangerous than he is. It is the story's longest-running joke, paying off on the largest possible stage. A coward and a con man seated among the true monsters of the sea. If you take one factual correction from tonight, let it be this: the four emperors are Shanks, Blackbeard, Luffy, and Buggy. Whitebeard, Kaido, and Big Mom are no longer among them. Kaido and Big Mom are worth pausing on, because they were the great mountain the crew had to climb in the longest arc of the series, and because their powers are exactly the kind of thing this world does so well. Kaido ate a mythical Zoan fruit that turns him into an enormous azure dragon, the Uo Uo no Mi, model Seiryu, and there is a lovely tangle of real myth folded into that name. The Seiryu is the azure dragon of Chinese and Japanese tradition, one of the four guardian beasts of the sky, and the word Uo means fish, which points at an old legend, the story of a carp that swims up a waterfall against the current and, by sheer persistence, transforms into a dragon at the top. Kaido, a creature of relentless force who cannot be killed and simply will not stop, is named after a fish that became a dragon by refusing to be stopped. His ally, the tyrant shogun of Wano, is named Orochi, after Yamata no Orochi, the eight-headed serpent slain in the oldest Japanese myths. Oda builds his monsters out of the region's actual folklore, and it rewards knowing where to look. Big Mom, Charlotte Linlin, is among the scariest figures in the story, precisely because her power is so intimate. She ate the Soru Soru no Mi, the soul fruit, which lets her manipulate the human soul directly, tearing lifespan out of people through their own fear, and pouring those stolen fragments of soul into objects, bringing them to life as loyal servants she calls homies. Her ship talks, her weather talks, her sword and her sun and her trees are living things she animated with pieces of frightened people's lives. She was raised, in a piece of backstory that connects to the current saga, on the island of the giants, and her origins are tangled up with a caretaker named Mother Carmel, who vanished without a trace on Linlin's own birthday, under circumstances the story leaves you to draw your own dark conclusions about. Both of them fell in the same climactic battle, plunged into the magma beneath the fortress island where the final fight took place. And I want to be careful about how I say what happened next, because this is a genuine trap that a lot of summaries get wrong. Oda has not, on the page, definitively shown either Kaido or Big Mom dead. There is no body, no confirmed death scene. The heroes believe Kaido is finished. A line of dialogue strongly implies Big Mom is gone, but the honest framing, the one that respects what the manga has actually shown, is that they were defeated, removed from the stage of emperors, and are presumed dead without official confirmation. In a story where characters have survived worse, that distinction matters, and I would rather tell you the uncertain truth than a clean falsehood. There was, for most of the series, a third pillar propping up the government side of that balance, and it is a system that no longer exists. It was called the Seven Warlords of the Sea, 7 powerful pirates granted official pardons by the government in exchange for occasional service, a way of turning some of the deadliest individuals in the world into a leash the government could yank when it needed muscle. Together with the emperors and the marine headquarters, the 7 warlords formed what the story called the 3 great powers, the tripod holding the world in tense balance. But at that great political summit, the reverie, the whole system was abolished. The kings, sickened by the crimes committed by warlords like the desert tyrant Crocodile and the puppet master Doflamingo, voted to end it, and the government stripped the remaining warlords of their immunity and sent the navy to hunt them down. To replace them, the government turned to its science division and built artificial weapons, the Seraphim, engineered soldiers modeled on the younger selves of the former warlords. The age of the sanctioned pirate is over. There is a piece of author's regret attached to this that I find quietly fascinating, because it shows Oda second-guessing his own architecture in public. He has said that he wishes he had never made it 7 warlords. His story, he has explained, was really built around the 4 of the emperors, and in hindsight he felt the number 7 was too many to give each warlord real weight. He has said he wishes he had made it the 5 warlords, or even the 2 warlords, a smaller, sharper group. It is a small confession, but it reminds you this enormous, seemingly inevitable structure was assembled by a person making judgment calls under deadline, some of which he would take back if he could. The number 7, a number tattooed into the memory of every fan, is a number its own creator regrets. The deadliest of all the pirates who rose through this shifting balance is Blackbeard, and he deserves his own moment, because he is the story's great patient schemer, the man who waited and plotted while everyone else charged ahead. Blackbeard is the only person alive carrying 2 devil fruits, as we touched on earlier, and he assembled that power through betrayal and grave robbing, murdering a crewmate to steal 1 fruit and taking the other from Whitebeard's dead body at the war. What I find especially elegant is how his name is built, because Oda took the real historical pirate Blackbeard, whose name was Edward Teach, and split him across 2 characters. Whitebeard's given name is Edward. Blackbeard's family name is Teach. The real Blackbeard was divided into the story's 2 greatest opposed forces, the noble old Titan and the treacherous young usurper, one holding the first name and one holding the last. And the crewmate Blackbeard murders to begin his rise is named Thatch, which is one of the alternate spellings of the real Edward Teach's surname. Oda took one dead pirate's name and grew 3 characters out of it. Blackbeard also owns what may be the strangest single page in the entire series, and it is a piece of production trivia that tells you how deliberate Oda is with his pencil. Back in the Mocktown sequence, in Volume 24, Blackbeard delivers a line about how the dreams of people never end, a declaration of the pirate spirit. And Oda drew that moment in a way he has reserved for no other panel in more than 100 volumes. He drew it across 2 full pages, and he stripped away all the background, every line of scenery gone, leaving only Blackbeard and his words in empty space. In a medium where the background is doing constant work, that total emptiness is a deliberate spotlight, and the fact that Oda has used it exactly once, on that specific line from that specific character, is a signal. He was telling you, in the grammar of the page itself, to remember this man. Most readers did not, until it was far too late. The pirates who challenge the world are not only the giants at the top, though. There is a whole generation of rising rookies who arrived on the scene all at once, a group the story calls the worst generation, and the way they came into being is one of the odder things about how this world was actually built. Just before the Great War that split the series into a before and an after, 11 rookie pirates gathered at the same island, the last stop before the deadly second half of the sea, and every one of them carried a bounty over 100 million, an enormous sum for newcomers. The story dubbed them the 11 Supernovas, and together with Blackbeard they came to be known as the worst generation, the crop of rising monsters the older powers would have to reckon with. Among them are names that now carry the whole weight of the story: Luffy and his swordsman Zoro, Trafalgar Law, the calculating surgeon pirate, Eustace Kid and his masked partner Killer, Jewelry Bonnie, Basil Hawkins, Scratchman Apu, X-Drake, Capone Beige, Urouge. These are, many of them, the shape of the story's future, the captains and commanders, who would go on to topple emperors. And I told you earlier we would come back to how they were made, because it is close to the best example in the whole franchise of how much of this seemingly grand design was fast, improvised work that got extremely lucky. By his own account, Oda sketched the supernovas in roughly 3 hours. 3 hours. His editor had complained that the Sabaody arc was not interesting enough, needed more energy, and Oda's response was to rapidly draw up this cluster of rookie pirates as a quick injection of stakes and color. What is astonishing is his own expectation of them, because he has said he assumed that around half of these characters would simply drop out of the story once they crossed into the new world, vanish the way the vast majority of a shonen manga's one-off characters do, never to be seen again. He did not draw them as pillars. He drew them as flavor, and he expected the sea to swallow most of them. Instead, the readers latched on, the characters demanded room, and that 3-hour afternoon sketch became the roster of the future emperors and captains steering the endgame of One Piece. The single most consequential group of rivals in the story was a rush job the author thought was half disposable. The names themselves are a treasure hunt, because Oda built the worst generation, almost to a person, out of real history's actual pirates and privateers, and tracing the references is its own quiet pleasure. Jewelry Bonnie is named for Anne Bonny, one of the few documented female pirates of the Golden Age. Eustace Kidd fuses two figures, the executed pirate William Kidd and a medieval outlaw called Eustace the Monk. Basil Hawkins takes his pieces from the privateer John Hawkins and the pirate navigator Basil Ringrose. Bellamy, a minor recurring antagonist, is named for Black Sam Bellamy, one of the wealthiest pirates who ever lived. And the swordsman at the center of it all, Roronoa Zoro, is named after the French buccaneer known as l'Olonais, a genuinely monstrous historical raider, and the detail I love is this. According to Oda's own back-of-the-volume column, Zoro is the only member of the Straw Hat crew named after a real pirate. Everyone else is drawn from other sources, actors, musicians, invented whole cloth. Only the swordsman carries a real corsair's name, which fits him, the one crewmate who feels like he stepped out of an older, harder world. The supernova who matters most for the mechanics of the whole world is Trafalgar Law, because his devil fruit sits at the center of one of the series' darkest secrets. Law ate the Ope Ope no Mi, the Op fruit, which is called in the story the ultimate devil fruit. It lets him create a spherical operating room in which he can cut, rearrange, and swap absolutely anything, bodies, objects, personalities, with the precision of a surgeon and none of the consequences. But its greatest ability, the one that gives it that ultimate title, is a single technique. The Ope Ope no Mi can grant another living person eternal youth, perpetual life, a permanent surgery against aging and death, and it comes with a price built into it, a price so exact it reads almost like a curse. Performing that immortality surgery kills the surgeon. The user of the fruit gives up their own life entirely to grant another person endless life. It is a power you can only ever use once, and only by dying. That single ability drives one of the saddest backstories in the series. The warlord Doflamingo, a man obsessed with living forever, engineered years of manipulation to try to force Law to grant him that immortality, and the whole tangled history of Law's childhood, of the man named Corazon who saved him, of the disease Law was dying of, is built around Doflamingo's hunger to cheat death. Law refused. He would not spend his life to give Doflamingo an eternal one. And the existence of that power, a devil fruit that can hand a person agelessness at the cost of one life, hangs over the whole upper reaches of the story, because there are figures at the very top of the world, on that empty throne, who do not seem to age at all. The story has been careful not to spell out the connection, and I will be careful too, because the mechanism of how the world's hidden rulers stay young is not confirmed. But the Ope Ope no Mi proves that eternal life is possible in this world, that it has a price, and that someone, somewhere, may have already paid it. That is the kind of thread Oda leaves hanging just close enough to touch. The worst generation are also, structurally, the reason the story could keep escalating without cheapening its old villains, because they gave Oda a bench of rising powers to promote into the vacancies left by the falling giants. When Kaido and Big Mom went down, it was supernovas who took them down, and it was supernovas, Luffy and Buggy, who rose to fill 2 of the empty emperor seats. The generation that arrived as a 3-hour sketch became the mechanism by which the whole board of power was reset. It is a wonderful accident, and it is one of the reasons I keep coming back to this idea across the whole video, that so much of what feels like grand, predestined architecture in one piece was a working artist making a fast call and then honoring it for 20 years until it looked like fate. Zoro carries one more secret worth mentioning here. One Oda, only confirmed late, in a question and answer column in a recent volume. The swordsman, the one crewmate named for a real pirate, is also descended from the samurai country. The crew would not reach until more than 900 chapters into the story. Oda confirmed that Zoro's bloodline traces back to a clan of Wano, the Shimotsuki, and that his birthday, the 11th of November, comes from the old lunar month name Shimotsuki. The village that trained him as a boy, far away in the East Blue, was founded by a swordsmith of that same Wano clan, the man who forged one of the great swords the story would eventually put in Zoro's hands. A connection between a boy in the East Blue and a hidden samurai nation on the far side of the world, planted at the very start, confirmed only decades later. Whether Oda knew it from the beginning or found it along the way almost does not matter. The point is that he made it fit. All of these rising rivals orbit one crew, the crew whose captain intends to stand above every one of them. And it is finally time to turn to the 9 people at the center of the whole story, because their dreams, their designs, and the astonishing amount Oda has worked out about each of them are a lore rabbit hole all their own. The Straw Hat Pirates are 9, and each one carries a dream that is really the reason they sail. Luffy, the captain, the boy in the straw hat, wants to become king of the pirates, which in this world means the freest man alive, the one who reaches the far end of the Grand Line. After his victory in the samurai country, his bounty climbed to 3 billion, a number that puts him among the deadliest people alive. Zoro, the swordsman, wants to become the greatest swordsman in the world, which means surpassing a specific man, the black-clad master Mihawk, and his own bounty passed 1 billion after the war in Wano. Nami, the navigator, wants to draw a complete map of the entire world, every island, every sea, a dream that silently requires the crew to survive the whole journey for her to fulfill it. Usopp, the sniper, the liar, the coward who keeps choosing courage anyway, wants to become a brave warrior of the sea like the father who left him. Sanji, the cook, is searching for a legendary ocean called the All Blue, the place where all 4 seas are said to meet and every fish in the world can be found. Chopper, the ship's doctor, a reindeer who ate a human fruit and can walk and talk and think, wants to become a doctor capable of curing any disease. Robin, the archaeologist, wants to uncover the true history of the Void Century, the very thing the world killed her family for studying. Frankie, the cyborg shipwright, built the cruise ship and wants to sail a dream vessel to the farthest island there is. And Brooke, the living skeleton, a musician brought back from death by a devil fruit, sails to keep a 50-year-old promise to a whale. Later Jinbei, a fishman and former warlord, takes the helm as the crew's proper helmsman. Those dreams are the emotional engine. But under them, Oda has built a scaffolding of detail so extensive and so unnecessary that it tells you something about the kind of mind running this story, and the best entry point is a single fact about the cook that delights me more than any other bit of trivia in the whole franchise. Sanji was almost named Naruto. In Oda's early design, the character's name came from the Naruto, the pink and white spiral fish cake you find in ramen, which is where his distinctive curled spiral eyebrow comes from. The eyebrow is a fish cake swirl. But while Oda was developing him, another young artist named Masashi Kishimoto launched a manga about a ninja, and that manga was called Naruto. Rather than collide with it, Oda changed his cook's name to Sanji. The perfect coda came years later, in a recorded conversation between the 2 men, when Kishimoto said that if Oda had not changed the name first, he himself would have had to rename his own hero. 2 of the best-selling manga of all time nearly shared a protagonist's name, and the only reason they did not is that a cook became Sanji so a ninja could stay Naruto. That is not an isolated case. Vivi, the princess of the Desert Kingdom, a deeply beloved ally of the early series, was never planned as a princess at all. She was introduced as a low-ranking agent of a criminal organization, a spy with a code name, and Oda has said that he only made her royalty after he happened to draw her with her hair down and thought she looked like a princess. Oda upgraded her to a queen-in-waiting. The villain Rob Lucci, the terrifying assassin with a pigeon on his shoulder who anchors one of the great arcs of the series, was invented essentially on the spot, a weird guy with a bird that Oda added mid-arc, replacing his original plan and becoming the true threat of the whole sequence. The pattern is the same one we keep running into, a story assembled by a person improvising brilliantly and then treating his own accidents as canon. Now let me take you into the deep archive, the question and answer columns Oda has published at the back of nearly every volume for decades, where he answers fan questions and, in doing so, reveals canon he never had room for in the story itself. The amount he has decided about these 9 people is honestly staggering. He has assigned each Straw Hat a real-world nationality, based purely on the feeling of their design. If they lived in our world, Luffy would be Brazilian, Zoro Japanese, Nami Swedish, Usopp South African, Sanji French, Chopper Canadian, Robin Russian, Frankie American, Brook Austrian, and Jinbei Indian. None of this appears in the story. It is just true, in Oda's head, filed away in a column. He has given each of them a secret animal motif, an animal they resemble beneath the human design. He has told us what each of them smells like, which is the kind of detail no author needs, and only a deeply committed one bothers to invent. Luffy smells of meat, Zoro of steel, Nami of oranges and money, which is a character sketch in 4 words, Usopp of gunpowder, Sanji of cigarettes and seafood, Robin of flowers, Frankie of cola, Brook of tea, Jinbei of seawater. When a fan asked what Chopper smelled like, Oda dodged the question entirely, throwing up his hands with a, "How am I supposed to know?" which is somehow the funniest possible answer. He has imagined the crew as a single family, and worked out what role each would play. In one version, Frankie is the father, and Robin the mother, and the rest are the children, and after Jinbei joined, the arrangement shifted, with Brook becoming the grandfather, and Jinbei the new father. He has assigned them real-world jobs, the ordinary careers they would hold if they were not pirates. Luffy would be a firefighter, Zoro a police officer, Sanji a hairdresser, Nami a nursery school teacher, Robin a flight attendant, Frankie a pilot, Brook a detective. And he has settled bar arguments the fans have had for years, like who among the crew can actually hold their drink, where the answer surprises people, because the heaviest drinker is not the swordsman everyone assumes. It is Jinbei, the fishman, ranked at the very top, with a taste for tequila, while Zoro comes in second. Oda has confirmed the cook Sanji is nowhere near the top of that list, despite his adult, worldly image. He will even resolve the fates of minor villains this way, decades after they leave the story. There was an invisible officer from the Thriller Bark arc, a creepy man named Absalom whose whole gimmick was turning invisible to spy on women. Long after his arc ended, in one of these columns, Oda revealed what became of him. He grew up, in a sense, and got a job. Absalom became a reporter for the world's biggest newspaper, and using his invisibility, he personally covered the Great War we talked about, standing unseen in the middle of the biggest battle in the world to file the story. It is a completely unnecessary piece of information, the sort of thing that appears nowhere in the manga, and it is exactly the kind of detail that makes the world feel like it continues to turn, even in the corners the camera has left behind. Characters do not simply vanish when their arc ends. They go off and have lives Oda has apparently already decided, filed away in the back of a book for anyone who thinks to ask. Some of these columns reinforce the story's deepest themes. Oda has confirmed that Nami and her sister Nojiko share no blood at all, that both are war orphans adopted by the same woman, which turns their sisterhood into a pure expression of the idea, running through the whole series, that family is a thing you choose and not a thing you inherit. He has clarified that 2 swordswomen who look almost identical, a girl from Zoro's childhood and a marine officer he meets years later, are not related, not reincarnations of each other, just a coincidence, both of them named after flightless birds. And he has revealed, in one of the databooks, that the reason a certain Okama revolutionary can blackmail the desert warlord Crocodile is that he holds a secret about Crocodile's past, a secret Oda has pointedly never spelled out, leaving fans to speculate for 2 decades about what it could possibly be. There is a smaller detail on Nami's body that I find genuinely moving once you know it. She wears a tattoo on her arm, a tangerine and a pinwheel, and it is not decoration. It replaced an older mark, the sun symbol of the pirate crew that enslaved her village and murdered the woman who raised her. When Nami finally broke free of that crew, she covered their brand with a tangerine for her adoptive mother Bellamere, who grew tangerines, and a pinwheel for the village guardian who watched over her. She turned the mark of her captivity into a small private memorial to the two people who loved her. It is the sort of thing you can watch the whole series and never have explained to you. A piece of grief worn openly on the arm of a character better known for stealing treasure and hitting her captain over the head. That is the texture I want you to carry away from the crew. On the surface, they are a comedy-adventure team, a rubber boy and a lost swordsman, and a thief and a liar and a cook and a talking reindeer. Underneath, each of them is anchored to a specific dream, a specific loss, and an absurd depth of authorial detail that mostly never surfaces. A whole invisible person standing behind the drawn one. And the same care that Oda pours into what his heroes smell like, he pours into where their faces come from. Because a startling number of the people in this world are portraits of real human beings. Start with the Marine Admirals, because this is the fact that reorganized how I look at the whole series. The Admirals are the Navy's ultimate weapons, 3 or 4 individuals so powerful that a single one of them can turn a war, and Oda drew each of them as a specific, recognizable Japanese screen actor. The relaxed, lazy admiral, known as Aokiji, is drawn as the actor Yusaku Matsuda. The merciless magma Admiral Akainu is drawn as Bunta Sugawara, a legend of the Japanese Yakuza film. The light-based Admiral Kizaru is drawn as Kuniya Tanaka, and it goes further than the face, because Kizaru's real name, Borsalino, and even his birthday come from Tanaka, from a role he played, and from the actor's own life. And the blind swordsman Admiral Fujitora is drawn directly as Shintaro Katsu in his most famous role, the blind masseur swordsman Zatoichi, which is why Fujitora is blind, why he carries a cane that hides a blade, why he fights with a lightning-fast draw, and why he gambles. His entire character is an homage to a classic film series. Once you know the admirals are portraits of actors, you cannot watch them the same way, because you are watching Oda direct a cast of cinema legends inside his own war. It does not stop at the admirals. A whole cluster of major characters are lifted, feature by feature, from Western screen and music icons, and the list reads like a party guest register from another dimension. Sanji's eyebrows and his particular brand of tough guy cool draw on Steve Buscemi's Mr. Pink from Reservoir Dogs. The desert warlord Crocodile takes his slicked, dangerous look from John Travolta's Vincent Vega in Pulp Fiction. Frankie's post-time-skip redesign, all jutting jaw and manic energy, is modeled on Jim Carrey as Ace Ventura. The flamboyant, pink-feathered Doflamingo is based on the French singer Michel Polnareff. Trafalgar Law, whose title in the story is The Surgeon of Death, is drawn after the motorcycle racer Valentino Rossi, whose own nickname happens to be the Doctor. Killer, the masked partner of the Kid Pirates, is styled after Guy Manuel of Daft Punk. Basil Hawkins takes his gaunt look from Joey Jordison of the band Slipknot, and the tragic figure Corazon is drawn after Alex DeLarge from A Clockwork Orange, single false eyelash and all. The musician Brooke is my favorite of these, because he is a chord of several people at once. Oda built him out of rock stars he loves, Ozzy Osbourne, Jimi Hendrix, Slash from Guns N' Roses, blended with the look of Jack Skellington from The Nightmare Before Christmas, which is exactly right for a flamboyant undead guitarist with an afro and a top hat, and the self-proclaimed god of the Sky Island, Enel, with his particular ears and his sneer, is cited as an homage to Eminem, which is a strange sentence to say out loud, and is nonetheless part of the design record. Even the names carry these double meanings once you learn to hear them. Doflamingo, the villain drawn after a French pop singer, has a name that fuses two things. The first part comes from Don Quixote, Cervantes' deluded knight, which is why his family name in the story is spelled the way it is, and why the whole clan has a faded, self-mythologizing Spanish nobility to them. The second part is simply flamingo, for the pink feathers, the long legs, the preening flamboyance. A Spanish literary knight crossed with a tropical bird, drawn as a French singer. That is 3 separate references stacked inside one character, and the story never once stops to explain any of them. The one family whose design is a puzzle box all its own is Sanji's. The Vinsmokes, the militarized royal bloodline he ran away from. The four Vinsmoke brothers are named, quite simply, after the Japanese words for the numbers 1 through 4. Their given names are the numerals, dressed up as names. The family is color-coded, each brother in his own bright shade, laid out exactly like a Super Sentai team, the genre that became Power Rangers in the West. And their eyebrows, the whole family's trademark, curl into the shape of the numeral 6, echoing the name of their kingdom's military, Germa 66. Sanji's own swirling brow, the one that started as a fish cake, turns out to rhyme visually with a family crest he spent his life trying to escape. The design is doing 3 jobs at once, telling you they are a team, telling you they are numbered like products rather than raised like children, and hiding a number in every face. I think the reason all of this matters, beyond the pleasure of spotting it, is what it tells you about how Oda actually works, which is by collage. He is not inventing faces from nothing in some pure act of imagination. He is a magpie, pulling a Yakuza actor here, and a rock star there, and a Renaissance novel, and a fish cake, and fusing them into something that reads as wholly original, even though almost every piece of it is a reference to something real. It is why the world feels so dense, so lived in, so full. Every corner of it is secretly made of the things one particular man spent his life loving, the films and the records and the myths and the history, all of it melted down and poured into pirates. When people say One Piece feels like a whole world, this is part of the mechanism. It is a whole world because it is secretly built out of ours. And the care extends into the parts of the story most fans in the West never even saw in their intended form. Because before the anime reached the audience it has now, it went through a version that cut it, renamed it, and in some cases rewrote it beyond recognition. And that story, of what was done to One Piece on its way overseas, is one of the strangest chapters in its history. When One Piece first came to the United States, it was licensed to a company called 4Kids Entertainment, and what happened next has become a kind of legend among fans. A case study in how badly a translation can go when the goal is not to bring a story across, but to sand it down into something unrecognizable. The 4Kids version did not simply clean up the odd rough edge. It cut the series by 39 episodes. It skipped 20 Japanese episodes outright, stitched surviving footage together to paper over the gaps, and erased whole arcs from existence. Entire stretches of the story that American viewers of that dub simply never knew had happened. Of the 104 episodes 4Kids dubbed, only 78 ever actually aired. A significant chunk of the early story was, for that audience, deleted. The individual changes are the part people remember, because so many of them are absurd. Sanji, the cook, is a lifelong smoker, a cigarette permanently at the corner of his mouth. And American rules about depicting smoking in children's programming meant that had to go. So 4Kids replaced his cigarette with a lollipop. A hardened, worldly, chain-smoking cook was given a candy on a stick. When the license later passed to Funimation, they took a third path, and rather than swap the cigarette for something else, they simply erased it, painting it out of his mouth frame by frame. The smoke-themed Marine officer named Smoker, whose entire identity is built around cigars and a smoke devil fruit, was renamed Chaser, presumably to avoid even naming the habit. Then there is the swordsman. For years, in the English releases, Roronoa Zoro was not called Zoro, he was called Zolo, his name changed by a single letter, and the reason was legal caution. The name Zoro was uncomfortably close to Zoro, the masked swordsman, a property that was tangled up in litigation at the time, and rather than risk it, the companies handling One Piece in English, across the dub and the manga, all agreed to shift him to Zolo. The original name was only restored years later, around the mid-2000s. A whole generation of Western fans first met the greatest swordsman in the world under a name that was not his, changed to dodge a lawsuit over a completely different character. Some of the changes crossed from silly into something more troubling, because they did not only soften the show, they rewrote its meaning. Nami's backstory contains one of the cruelest deaths of the early series. The moment her adoptive mother is shot in front of her by the fishman pirate who has occupied their village. The 4Kids version could not show that, so the shooting was rewritten as an imprisonment, the mother taken away rather than killed. And that single change caused a bizarre continuity error downstream, because to remove the death, 4 kids reused and rearranged animation from earlier scenes, and in doing so they accidentally placed one of the Fishman characters in 2 different locations at the same time. Elsewhere, the death of Zoro's childhood friend and rival, a girl whose fatal accident is the emotional root of his entire dream, was changed. In the original, she dies falling down a flight of stairs, a cruel and pointless accident. In the dub, that was rewritten so that she was instead beaten by, in the dub's own framing, sexist sore losers. The rewrite reached for a less arbitrary tragedy and landed somewhere stranger. One character's entire nature was suppressed for years across multiple versions, and his story is a little sad. Monclay, a flamboyant, big-hearted Okama character, a term for a specific queer identity in Japanese, is canonically and openly who he is, and it is treated by the story as part of what makes him brave and loyal and, ultimately, heroic. But even in Toei's own handling, and certainly in the Western releases, his identity was scrubbed. His fighting style, which openly references who he is, was renamed to bland things like crazy karate and ballet kempo. The suppression was only really lifted around the prison arc where his heroism becomes undeniable, and it was only Funimation's later subtitled version that finally translated the word describing him plainly. For years, the show was willing to use his courage while hiding what it was rooted in. What fascinates me is that this instinct to quietly revise is not only something that happened to One Piece in translation. Oda does a gentler version of it himself, in his own publishing process, between the weekly magazine and the collected book. There is a well-documented example in a chapter numbered 863. When it first ran in the weekly magazine, one of its pages was an incredibly dense crowd shot, hundreds of tiny individual headshots packed edge to edge, a wall of faces. When the chapter was later collected into a volume, that overwhelming page was swapped out for a simpler, cleaner spread. And more routinely, the full-color cover pages Oda draws for the magazine are reprinted in plain grayscale in the collected books, their colors stripped for the archive. The story you read in the weekly and the story preserved in the volumes are not always exactly the same, revised in small ways by the author's own hand. I find the whole localization saga worth telling, not to mock the people who did it, though some of it is hard to defend, but because of what survived it. One Piece came to much of the Western world first, in a form that was cut by dozens of episodes, renamed to dodge a lawsuit, stripped of its cigarettes and its grief and its queerness, and it still, eventually, broke through. The uncut version won. The real names came back. The audience that fell in love with the sanded-down version grew up and demanded the actual thing, and got it. There is something reassuring in that a story with this much specific, stubborn identity could be blurred for years on its way to you, and still arrive intact in the end, because the thing underneath was too strong to stay hidden. That strength, that stubbornness, is exactly what the story itself is about, and nothing carries it better than a single object passed from hand to hand across generations. A battered old straw hat that has been on more heads than you might think. The hat is the title. It is right there in the crew's name, the Straw Hats, and it belongs to Luffy, a worn old straw hat with a red band that he never takes off, that he guards more fiercely than his own life. Most viewers know the basic story of how he got it. As a small boy in a sleepy village called Fuchsia, Luffy idolized a red-haired pirate named Shanks, whose crew was resting in the harbor. And when a sea monster nearly killed the boy, Shanks saved him, losing an arm to the creature's jaws in the process. And afterward, Shanks placed his own treasured straw hat on Luffy's head and told him to give it back one day, when he had become a great pirate. It is the promise the entire series is built on, a debt of a hat, a boy vowing to grow into the man who can return it. What most people do not realize is that the hat did not start with Shanks. It is older than that, and its journey is one of the purest expressions of the story's central idea, which is inherited will, the notion that dreams and purpose are handed down like an heirloom, from the dying to the living, across generations. The straw hat originally belonged to Gol D. Roger, the pirate king himself. Somewhere along the way it passed from Roger to a young Shanks, who as a child was a member of Roger's crew, and Shanks carried it for years before setting it on Luffy's head. So when Luffy wears it, he is wearing the Pirate King's hat, the same hat that sat on the head of the only man to conquer the sea, passed down through the red-haired pirate who linked the two eras. Roger to Shanks to Luffy. The hat is the thread that ties the current king of the pirates directly back to the last one, an unbroken line of will running through a single piece of headwear. Where Shanks came from is tangled up in that God Valley incident we talked about at the very start, the battle where Roger and Garp destroyed the Rocks pirates roughly 38 years ago. It was there, on that island, that the infant Shanks was found. The details of his origin are among the freshest and most actively developing parts of the story, so I will hold them lightly, but the through line is clear enough. Shanks came out of the hidden event that did more than any other to shape the world's recent history, was raised on the Pirate King's own ship, inherited the hat, and grew up to become one of the 4 emperors, the single pirate the world government seems to fear most in a personal way. When Shanks moves, the top of the world pays attention. Now here is where the modern story reached back and rewrote the meaning of that lost arm, and it is among the sharpest recent revelations in the story, so I want to be precise about the layers of it. In the very first prototype of the story, the 1996 one-shot, Shanks did not lose his arm to a sea monster at all. He lost it to a shark. When the story was properly serialized, Oda changed it to the Sea King, the great sea beast that attacks Luffy, and for decades that was the version everyone knew, a pirate sacrificing his arm to save a child from a monster. A clean and beautiful image of selflessness. But in a very recent chapter, numbered around 1152, Oda tied the lost arm to something far larger than a random beast. The revelation connects Shanks's arm to a brand, a mark associated with Imu, the hidden ruler of the world. The arm Shanks gave up was, in this newer light, marked, significant, bound to the deepest secret at the top of the world, and it was that arm he tore away to save Luffy. What began, in a pilot chapter, as a shark bite, became a Sea King in the manga, and has now become something tied to the god on the empty throne. The same event deepened twice across nearly 30 years, until a simple act of heroism turned out to be threaded through the central mystery of the entire series. This is the sort of thing Oda does that I find remarkable as a piece of craft, because it is retroactive without feeling cheap. He did not always know what Shanks's arm would mean. There is even a documented case where Shanks's appearance at the Great War overrode an earlier statement in the story that he and his crew were busy elsewhere, fighting Kaido, a small inconsistency born of a writer adjusting his plans in real time. But the direction he keeps adjusting toward is deeper connection, more meaning, threads pulled tighter. He treats his own earlier work as raw material to be enriched, rather than a cage to be trapped in, and the result is a story where even the oldest, most familiar images keep gaining weight the longer the story runs. The Straw Hat itself has one more layer of mystery, because it has been shown, in a heavily guarded vault in Merijois, that there is a straw hat kept as one of the government's most protected treasures, a hat that some fans believe connects to an ancient figure. I will not overclaim here, because the story has been careful and coy about it, but the presence of a treasured straw hat locked in the vault of the world's rulers, in a series whose hero is defined by a straw hat, is not an accident. It is another of those threads left dangling just close enough to touch, a promise that the hat on Luffy's head means even more than the beautiful thing we already know it means. What all of this inheritance keeps circling back to is death, because will is only passed down when someone dies to pass it. Roger's will passed at an execution. Shanks's hat was a survivor's gift, and the story's whole engine of inherited purpose runs on loss, on people dying and handing what they carried to whoever is left standing. So to really understand the heart of One Piece, you have to look at its great tragedies, the deaths and erasures that the survivors have been carrying ever since. And the first of them is the quiet slaughter of an island full of scholars whose only crime was wanting to read. There was an island called Ohara in the West Blue, and it was home to the finest library and the greatest archaeologists in the world. The scholars of Ohara studied the past, the true past, and in doing so they broke the one law the world government enforces above all others. They read the forbidden stones, the poneglyphs, and began piecing together the history of the Void Century, the 100 years no one is permitted to know. They were not soldiers, they were not a threat in any ordinary sense. They were a tree of scholars, led by an old professor named Clover, whose entire crime was scholarship, the desire to know what had happened and to write it down. The government's response was total. It called a buster call, which is the cruelest instrument the Navy possesses, a coordinated bombardment by a fleet of warships and admirals with a single purpose: to erase a target so completely that nothing remains. Not to capture, not to occupy, to wipe an island off the map, buildings and books and people alike, until there is only ocean where the place used to be. And they turned it on Ohara, on a library and the scholars who loved it, because knowledge itself was the enemy. The great tree burned, the books burned. The scholars who had spent their lives protecting the past died trying to save even fragments of it, and the island was reduced to nothing. It happened roughly 22 years before the story's present, and it is the single clearest statement the series ever makes about what the world government actually is, because there is no reading of a buster call on a library that makes the people who ordered it anything other than monstrous. Out of that fire, one person survived, a little girl, 8 years old, an archaeologist already despite her age, a child prodigy who could read the ancient stones the way her mother and the other scholars could. Her name was Nika Robin, and she is the reason Ohara matters to the present, because she carries forward the exact ability the government committed genocide to erase. She is, as far as the story has shown, the only living person who can read the poneglyphs. Everything the government did at Ohara, all that death, was meant to close the door on the true history forever, and it failed, because one child made it off the island alive carrying the very knowledge they were trying to destroy. She made it off because of a giant. There was a former Marine officer, a vice admiral named Jaguar D. Saul, and notice the letter in his name, the D, because it matters. Saul was a giant, a good-hearted one, who had defected from the Navy rather than take part in the horror of Ohara, and he protected the child Robin as the island died around them, teaching her, in the middle of an apocalypse, how to laugh. His whole lesson to her, in that fire, was that no matter how alone she felt, somewhere out on the sea, there would one day be people who would welcome her, friends who would be glad she was alive, and that she should keep living until she found them. It is a heartbreaking sequence, one of the saddest the series has told, precisely because it is so gentle, a giant teaching a doomed child to smile while the world burns. Saul was stopped by his own former colleague, a Marine named Kuzan, the man who would later become the Admiral Aokiji, the one drawn after Yusaku Matsuda. Kuzan had the power of ice, and he used it to freeze Saul. But here is the complication that makes Kuzan one of the story's most morally tangled figures. He deliberately let Robin escape. He gave the child a route off the island, allowed the one survivor to slip away, an act of quiet mercy from a man serving the machine that was committing the atrocity. That single choice would echo for decades, and Saul, the giant, turns out not to have died there at all. The story has since revealed that he survived, and made his way to Elbaf, the giant's homeland, carrying with him rescued books from Ohara, preserving fragments of the very knowledge the government thought it had burned to ash. The library was not entirely lost. A giant carried pieces of it away. The cruelty that followed Robin from that day is its own long tragedy. The government put an enormous bounty on her when she was 8 years old, branded her a demon, and hunted her across the world for the crime of surviving, so that she grew up unable to trust anyone, betrayed again and again, convinced that anyone who got close to her would eventually turn her in for the price on her head. Her arc, when she finally joins the crew, is about learning that Saul was right, that there really are people who are simply glad she is alive. The emotional peak of it, the moment the crew declares war on the whole world to get her back and she finally screams that she wants to live, lands as one of the story's great cathartic moments. And it only lands the way it does because of what happened at Ohara, because a little girl was taught to keep living by a giant in a burning library. I think Ohara is the key that opens up the whole moral architecture of One Piece. And here is my honest take on it. A lot of adventure stories have an evil empire, but they usually make it evil in cartoonish ways. Cruelty for its own sake, villains who twirl their mustaches. Oda made his ultimate power structure evil in a way that is far more disturbing and far more real. Because the government's great sin is not sadism, it is the destruction of knowledge to protect power. The thing they will burn an island to prevent is not a weapon or an army. It is a book being read, and once you understand that the world government will commit genocide to keep a history unknown, every polite, orderly, official thing they do afterward reads as a threat, because you have seen what they are willing to do to a library. The Buster Call on Ohara is the shadow that falls across the entire rest of the series. That shadow reaches its darkest point at a place called Marineford, where the story staged the largest and most consequential battle it had ever shown, over the life of a single young man whose only real crime was who his father turned out to be. To understand Marineford, you have to go back to 3 boys in a forest, because the emotional weight of the whole war rests on a bond formed years earlier between children. In the woods above a kingdom on Dawn Island, 3 orphans grew up together, raised roughly by a bandit named Dadan at the request of Luffy's grandfather Garp. There was Luffy, small and stubborn. There was Ace, older, angrier, carrying a secret about his parentage that made him doubt whether he deserved to exist at all. And there was Sabo, the runaway son of a noble family who wanted nothing to do with the corrupt world he had been born into. The 3 of them shared cups of sake and swore themselves brothers, not by blood, but by choice. And that vow is the beating heart of some of the rawest material in the entire series. Sabo, the middle brother in spirit, seemed to die when they were still boys. He set out to sea in a small boat, and a celestial dragon, one of those masked world nobles, saw the boat flying a pirate flag, and, offended by the mere gesture, fired on it and destroyed it, killing a child for the crime of pretending to be free. It is one more entry in the ledger of what the nobles are allowed to do. But Sabo did not actually die. He was pulled from the water, gravely injured, his memory gone, and he was taken in by the Revolutionary Army, by Luffy's own father Dragon, and he grew up there, amnesiac, not knowing he had brothers, rising through the revolution until he became its chief of staff, the second most important person in the organization, dedicated to tearing down the very class of people who tried to kill him as a boy. Sabo is alive. That is a fact many people who dropped the story long ago do not know. The middle brother lived, forgot, and came back. Ace, the oldest, took a different road, and it led him to Marineford. Ace grew up and became a pirate, joining the crew of the Emperor Whitebeard and rising to command one of its divisions, loved and respected, having finally found a father figure who told him he was glad Ace had been born. And then Ace was captured, and the world learned the secret he had carried his whole life, the reason he had doubted his own right to exist. His father was Gol D. Roger. Ace was the son of the Pirate King, born to a woman named Portgas de Rouge, who, in an act of almost unbelievable love and endurance, carried him in the womb for around 20 months, far beyond any natural term, willing her pregnancy to last, so that her child would not be born in the year the government was hunting for Roger's offspring. She held her son inside her for nearly 2 years to hide him from a world that would have killed a newborn for his bloodline, and the effort of it killed her. Ace lived because his mother refused to let him be born on schedule. The government scheduled Ace's public execution, specifically to draw out Whitebeard, to force the greatest pirate crew in the world into a battle on the Navy's home ground, and it worked. Whitebeard came, with all his allies, and the Navy assembled its full might, its admirals, its warlords, its entire war machine, and the 2 forces collided at Marineford in the Summit War, the largest battle the series had ever depicted. Luffy, desperate, broke into and out of the world's greatest prison to be there, to try to save the brother he had left. And after everything, after the whole war fought over his life, Ace was killed. He died taking a magma-fisted blow from the Admiral Akainu that was aimed at Luffy, dying to shield his little brother. The 2 of them reunited, only long enough for one to die in the other's arms. It is, for a great many fans, the moment the series stopped being only an adventure. Ace is definitively dead. He is not coming back. The story has been absolute about that, and the finality is part of the wound. Whitebeard died too, in that same battle, and the manner of it matters. The old emperor, betrayed and swarmed and riddled with wounds, died standing up, on his feet, never once falling, and with close to his last breath he confirmed to the entire watching world the thing that drives the whole story. He told them the One Piece is real. He shouted that Roger's treasure exists, that it is out there, and that one day someone would find it and turn the whole world upside down. The government had wanted this war to close the age of piracy for good, and instead the strongest man in the world used his death to reignite it, confirming the dream in front of a global broadcast. It is the same shape as Roger's execution all those years before, an attempt to end the pirate era becoming the thing that fuels it, and Oda rhymed the 2 deliberately. The war changed everything. It broke Luffy so badly that he nearly gave up, and it triggered the great structural turning point of the series. The moment the crew, scattered across the world, agreed to spend 2 full years training apart before reuniting stronger. Everything before that war, the story calls pre-time skip. Everything after, post-time skip. It is the hinge the whole series turns on, and it is soaked in the grief of that one death on that one platform. Here is the take I will leave this on, because I think it is the truest thing about Marineford. The war was not really about Ace. Ace was the bait. The war was the world government demonstrating, on the largest possible stage, that it would spend any amount of blood to control the story of the world, to erase a bloodline, to make an example, to close a door. And it lost, in the only way that mattered, because the dying words of the man they killed did the exact opposite of what they intended, exactly as Rogers had. The government keeps trying to end this story with a public death, and every single time, the death becomes a beginning. That is the pattern under all of it, and it is why the government, for all its power, is losing a war it does not fully understand it is fighting. And that same war produced one more casualty who did not die but was, in some ways, treated worse than the dead. A man turned into a machine, whose story the series would not fully tell for years, and which turned out to be one of the saddest things Oda has ever written. His name is Bartholomew Kuma, and for most of the series he is a mystery. A huge, silent man in a Bible-carrying, paw-print pose, one of the government's sanctioned warlords, seemingly a loyal enforcer. He has a devil fruit called the paw-paw fruit, which lets him repel anything at all with a push of his palms, deflecting attacks, even pushing away abstract things like pain and memory. And for a long time that is all we know of him, a quiet giant who follows orders. The truth, revealed across the recent saga, recolors every appearance he ever made. Kuma belongs to a people called the Buccaneers, a race the world government fears and persecutes for reasons tied to the deepest history of the world. He was born in a small kingdom in the South Blue, and as a child he was enslaved by the celestial dragons, branded, made property, subjected to the specific cruelty those nobles inflict on anyone below them, which for a buccaneer child was total. He grew up to become a revolutionary, fighting alongside Luffy's father against the very system that had owned him, and he became a father himself, in the way this story cares most about, not by blood but by choice, taking in and raising a little girl named Jewelry Bonnie, one of the very rookie pirates we talked about earlier, loving her as his own daughter. Bonnie fell gravely ill with a rare disease, and to save her, Kuma made the worst bargain imaginable. The government, through the elder Saturn, offered him a way to secure his daughter's future, but the price was himself. Kuma agreed to let the government's chief scientist convert him, piece by piece, into a machine. He allowed himself to be turned into a fully robotic weapon, a will-less human pacifist, his free will surgically removed, his personality erased. His memories were extracted from him and stored separately, drained out of the man like water from a cup, until what remained was an obedient machine wearing his face, a weapon the government could point at its enemies. He gave up his entire self, his mind, his memories, his soul, everything that made him a person, to buy his daughter's survival, and he did it slowly, knowing exactly what he was losing at each step. Here is the detail that turns his story from tragic to almost unbearable, and it reaches all the way back into the plot, in a way most viewers never register the first time. Before he was fully hollowed out, while he still had some fragment of will left, Kuma did something with his repelling power that reshaped the entire series. At the end of the Sabaody arc, when the Straw Hat crew was cornered and about to be captured or killed after Marineford's prelude, it was Kuma who used his paw-paw fruit to strike each of them, one by one, and fling them away. To the viewer, in the moment, it looks like an attack. It looks like Kuma, the government's dog, scattering and destroying the crew. But he was not destroying them, he was saving them. He launched each straw hat to a distant, specific place where they would be safe, and where, as it turned out, each of them would find exactly the training they needed to grow strong enough to survive the new world. The event that split the crew apart for 2 years, the thing that looked like their worst defeat, was a dying man's act of protection, one of his last free choices before his will was taken from him completely. He used the final scraps of his own agency to save 9 strangers, because his heart, even mostly erased, could not do otherwise. At Egghead, in the recent saga, the story pays all of this off, as flickers of the person Kuma used to be surface inside the machine, as his daughter Bonnie learns who her father really was and what he sacrificed, as the full shape of his love becomes visible for the first time. It is a sustained gut punch of an arc, and it works because Oda planted it so patiently, letting a character stand around in the background as a menacing enforcer for hundreds of chapters, while secretly he was the most selfless person in the entire story. My honest reaction to Kuma's full reveal is that it is the clearest example of the thing One Piece does better than almost anything else, which is the long-delayed recontextualization, the moment where an image you have carried for a decade flips completely, and you realize you were watching love the whole time and mistook it for violence. Kuma also embodies the story's quiet argument about what family actually is, the same argument running through Nami and her adoptive mother, through the three sworn brothers, through the crew Oda imagines as parents and children. Over and over, One Piece tells you that the bonds that matter are chosen, that a bandit can raise a hero, that a woman can carry orphans who share no blood, that a persecuted slave can become the truest father in the story. Against a world organized entirely around bloodline, around the inherited divine right of the celestial dragons, the heroes keep insisting that blood is not what makes a family. Kuma, who gave up everything he was for a daughter who was not his by birth, is maybe the strongest statement of that whole idea in the series. These tragedies, Ohara and Marineford and Kuma, are the emotional foundation the story stands on, but they are all in service of a set of mysteries the series has been building toward since its very first pages. The questions about ancient weapons and a sun god and a treasure at the world's edge, and those are where we are heading next. 10,000 meters beneath the surface, at the very bottom of the sea, under the shadow of the world's only continent, there is a kingdom in the dark. Fishman Island, lit not by the sun but by an enormous glowing tree whose light filters down through miles of black water, home to the fishmen and the merfolk, two peoples who have lived under the ocean for as long as anyone can remember. The fishmen are humanoid and immensely strong, far stronger than humans in the water. The merfolk have the tails of fish and are the fastest swimmers in the world, and their island is one of the loveliest and saddest places in the whole story, because its history is a long chronicle of being hated. The Fishman Island arc is, openly and deliberately, an allegory about racism, and Oda does not soften it. For generations, fishmen and merfolk have been enslaved by humans, hunted by the celestial dragons for their aquarium collections, despised and feared and treated as a lower form of life. The story gives this history real weight through a handful of figures. There is Fisher Tiger, a fishman hero who was himself enslaved by the world nobles, who broke into Marijua, the holy city itself, and freed the slaves there, and who founded a crew, the Sun Pirates, to carry other freed fishmen to safety. Tiger was a liberator, and yet even he could not fully overcome his own hatred of the humans who had branded him. A tragedy the story treats with real honesty about how hard it is to let go of a wound like that. There is Queen Otohime, a mermaid queen who spent her life advocating for coexistence, for reconciliation between the races, and who was assassinated for it. There is Jinbei, Tiger's successor as captain of the Sun Pirates, a former warlord, who eventually becomes the Straw Hats' helmsman, the first non-human to formally join the crew. And there is Arlong, the fishman supremacist whose hatred of humans curdled into pure cruelty, the villain of the early series who enslaved Nami's village and murdered her mother, whose racism is shown as the poisoned mirror image of Otohime's hope. What I appreciate about how Oda handles it is that he does not flatten it into a simple lesson. The fishmen are not all saints. The humans are not all monsters. The hatred runs in both directions, and is shown to be understandable in both directions, and destructive in both directions. It is a surprisingly mature treatment for a shonen adventure, and it sits on the ocean floor like a foundation stone under the lighter material above it, a reminder that this bright, funny, absurd world is built on top of some very heavy history. Fishman Island also holds one of the three great ancient weapons, and here we step into the deepest layer of the world's mysteries. During the Void Century, the era no one is allowed to remember, three weapons existed, each powerful enough to shift the balance of the whole world, and each named after a god. They are called Pluton, Poseidon, and Uranus, named for the underworld, the sea, and the sky, and their names match their natures. Pluton, named for the god of the underworld, is a warship, an ancient battleship said to be capable of destroying an entire island with a single blast. Its blueprints were hidden away in Wano, protected by the shipwright family there, and one man who studied a copy of those blueprints chose to burn them rather than let such a weapon come back into the world. The actual Pluton is rumored to sleep somewhere beneath Wano, still waiting. Poseidon is the one that reframes everything, because Poseidon is not a machine at all. Poseidon is a person. Specifically, Poseidon is the current mermaid princess of Fishman Island, a huge, gentle, tearful girl named Shirahoshi, who was born with an ability that appears only once in centuries, the power to call and command the Sea Kings, those colossal sea monsters large enough to swallow ships. The ancient weapon named for the god of the sea is a shy princess who can summon the leviathans of the deep with her voice, and the name Poseidon passes down to whichever mermaid is born, generations apart, with that power. It is a beautiful inversion, an apocalyptic weapon that is also a crying teenage girl who would never willingly hurt anyone, and that is what makes her so dangerous, because whoever could control her would control the sea itself. The third weapon, Uranus, named for the sky, is the one the story has kept almost entirely hidden. As of the current arcs, its nature has not been definitively revealed. Fans have theorized endlessly, drawing on the Sky Association, but I am going to hold to what is actually known, which is very little, because Uranus is one of the genuine remaining blanks on the board, a promise the story has not yet cashed. What we do know is the shape of the danger, that 3 world-ending relics from the buried century exist, that one is a ship, one is a person, and one is still a shadow, and that the race to control or protect them is part of what the endgame is about. Threaded through Fishman Island is the first appearance of a name that has become central to everything. On a poneglyph down in the dark, near that undersea kingdom, there is an apology, written by a figure from the void century to the fishmen, a promise he made and could not keep and asked forgiveness for. It is signed Joy Boy. That was the first time that name entered the story, hundreds of chapters before it would come to mean what it means now, an ancient hero, a promise unkept, a debt waiting across 800 years to be paid, and the person the whole story has been building toward, the one who might finally keep Joy Boy's promise, is the boy in the straw hat, because of the true nature of the power he has carried since the very first chapter, a power that turned out to be the biggest secret in the series. For more than 1,000 chapters, everyone believed the same thing about Luffy's power. He ate the gum-gum fruit, a paramecia that turned his body to rubber, letting him stretch and bounce and snap back. It was the very first devil fruit the story ever showed, the foundational gimmick of the whole series, the reason a boy in a straw hat can throw a punch from across a harbor. It was rubber. Simple, silly, iconic rubber. And in chapter 1044, Oda revealed that this was a lie, and that the lie was 800 years old. Luffy's fruit was never the gum-gum fruit. It is a mythical zoan, the rarest class of all, called the human fruit, model Nika. Nika is a mythical figure, a sun god, a warrior of liberation spoken of in legend, a being who was said to bring smiles and freedom to the enslaved and the suffering, who fought with a joyful heart and made the impossible look like play. Luffy did not eat a rubber fruit. He ate the fruit of a god, and he has been unknowingly carrying the power of the sun god of liberation since he was a small boy stealing it off Shanks's ship. And this is where the deepest paranoia of the world government comes into focus, because the 5 elders revealed something staggering. For 800 years, the government has been trying to capture this specific fruit, hunting it across the world, because of what it represents. And for 800 years, they have failed, because the fruit kept escaping them, vanishing and reappearing, reincarnating in new places, behaving, in the elders' own frightened words, as if it had a will of its own, as if it did not want to be caught. They wanted it so badly, and feared it so much, that they gave it a false name. They renamed the fruit of the sun god the gum-gum fruit, a boring, harmless label, specifically to hide it, to bury the legend of Nika under the dullest possible disguise, so that no one would go looking for it. The most important devil fruit in the world was hidden in plain sight under a joke name for 8 centuries, and then a random boy in the East Blue ate it by accident because it was sitting on a pirate's table looking like candy. The thing the government had chased for 800 years was swallowed by a 7-year-old who just thought it looked tasty. When Luffy awakens that fruit, in the climax of the Wano arc, it is called Gear 5, and it is the awakening of the Zoan he always had, not some new power grafted on. His body and the world around him become cartoonishly, impossibly elastic, reality itself turning rubbery at his touch, because Nika's power is described as being limited only by imagination, the freedom to do anything, to make a fight into play. It is the story literalizing its own theme, freedom as a superpower, joy as strength, and it ties Luffy directly to the ancient figure of Joy Boy, because Joy Boy, the first pirate, the maker of that unkept promise, is bound up with Nika. When Luffy awakened, a character on Fishman Island felt it and said that Joy Boy had returned. The boy chasing the Pirate King's treasure may be the reincarnation of the will the whole hidden history has been waiting for. Here is the piece of trivia that makes my jaw drop every time I think about it, because it suggests this twist is older than almost anyone realized. Long before One Piece, when Oda was still a teenager, he drew a one-shot, an early amateur work, and inside it, there was a character described as a rubber tree spirit, an entity given an age of over 5,000 years, whose laugh was written out on the page as a booming wah-ha-ha-ha-ha. A rubber spirit, thousands of years old, laughing. Read now, decades later, in the light of a rubber sun god of liberation, tied to an 800-year mystery, it looks like Oda accidentally sketched the seed of his biggest twist as a teenager, before he had any idea what it would become. In all fairness, this is most likely coincidence. A young artist reusing a fun idea, not a master plan laid down in adolescence. But the resonance is uncanny. A laughing rubber spirit of great age turning up in the juvenilia of the man who would grow up to write a laughing rubber god of liberation. The place all of this is heading is a single island, the last one, the end of the sea. Roger's crew reached it and named it Laugh Tale, and the name is the clue. They did not find horror there, or at least not only horror. They found something that made them laugh, all of them, standing at the end of the world. Roger learned the entire truth on that island, the whole history of the Void Century, the meaning of the ancient weapons, the truth of the letter D, and whatever the One Piece physically is. And his response, and his whole crew's response, was laughter, which is why fans have spent years wondering what could possibly be, at the end of the deadliest sea in the world, that would make the people who conquered it laugh, rather than weep or rage. We do not know what the One Piece is. That is the honest state of it after nearly 30 years. Oda has promised it is a real, physical treasure, not a metaphor, and he has said he already drew the final panel, so somewhere in a drawer or a locked file, the ending exists. There is a final stone, sometimes called the Rio Poneglyph, said to hold the complete true history when assembled, and there is the treasure itself, and Oda has kept both almost totally hidden. The one thing we have been told, again and again, is that it will be worth the journey, and that a dying pirate king thought it was worth turning the whole world upside down to point at. Even Ace's flame fruit, the firepower he died carrying, found its way back to his brother Sabo after his death. Another small inheritance passed to the living, another thread pulled forward. Everything in this story flows toward that final island, and the man who has been steering it there since 1997 is finally, in the last stretch, letting the answers come. That last stretch, the current saga, is where the deepest science and the oldest history are colliding all at once, in the lab of a dying genius and on an island of giants, and it is worth taking stock of where the story actually stands tonight. The current era of One Piece, the final saga, opened on an island called Egghead, the highest tech place in the world, a futuristic laboratory built by the single smartest person alive, Dr. Vegapunk. And Vegapunk is one of the strangest and most inventive characters Oda has ever built, because Vegapunk is not one person, he is many. The original scientist, the man himself, whom the others call Stella, split his own intellect into 6 separate bodies, 6 living satellites, each one embodying a single facet of his personality, so that he could do 6 lifetimes of work at once. There is Shaka, who represents his goodness, Lilith, his evil, or perhaps his mischief, Edison, his capacity for thought, Pythagoras, his wisdom. Atlas, his violence, and York, his greed. 6 people who are all one man, working in parallel, and his actual removed brain is kept separately, stored as a thing called punk records, the central archive of his mind. It is a wild idea, a genius so productive he had to become a committee of himself. Vegapunk's science underpins the entire modern military of the world government. The cyborg soldiers called pacifista, the artificial weapons called seraphim, the cloning, the replication of devil fruit powers, all of it runs on his work. And at the center of his research is a concept the story calls the lineage factor, which is essentially this world's version of DNA, the genetic blueprint of a living thing. By reading and rewriting the lineage factor, Vegapunk can, in principle, copy abilities, engineer creatures, do things that edge toward playing God, and it is exactly this power, this deep knowledge of the building blocks of life, and of the world's forbidden history, that makes him too dangerous to let live. Because that is what the Egghead arc becomes, a mission to kill the smartest man in the world before he can tell it what he knows. The government sends its most elite forces, the intelligence agents of Cypher Pole, the Admiral Kizaru, that light-speed portrait of the actor Kuni Tanaka, and one of the 5 elders, J. Garcia Saturn, a horrifying figure who reveals a monstrous transformation. And the betrayal comes from inside, because one of Vegapunk's own satellites, York, the one embodying his greed, turns on the others. York's dream is simple and selfish. She wants to become a celestial dragon, to ascend to that untouchable ruling class, and she is willing to trade away the Void Century research and a devastating new energy source called the Mother Flame to the government to get it. The genius, destroyed partly by a piece of his own greed, given a face and a will of its own, is a very dark little parable about the thing that corrupts even the best mind. Vegapunk is mortally wounded on Egghead, impaled by the Elder Saturn, and finished under the assault that follows. But he has prepared for exactly this, and his death triggers the most important broadcast in the history of the world, because Vegapunk, knowing the government would eventually silence him, recorded a message to be transmitted to the entire world upon his death, a message that reaches every corner of the globe at once, unstoppable, playing over every communication channel there is. And in it he begins to tell the world the truth it has been forbidden for 800 years. He does not get to say all of it. The government fights desperately to cut the transmission, and it is interrupted before the deepest secrets come out. But what does get through is earth-shaking. He reveals that the world is, literally, sinking, that the sea levels have been rising slowly ever since the Void Century, that the ocean has already swallowed parts of the world that used to be dry land, and that this slow drowning is connected to whatever happened in that forbidden century. He confirms the existence and the danger of the ancient weapons. He connects the deep history to the figure of Joy Boy and to the founding of the current order. And he confirms, to the whole listening world, the thing that started everything, that the One Piece is real. A dead man, murdered specifically to keep him quiet, spoke to every person on the planet at once, and began pulling down the 800-year lie. It is Ohara in reverse. The government burned a library to keep the truth buried, and a single scientist turned his own murder into the largest lecture ever given. And then, in the moment that defines the whole endgame, the true ruler of the world acts. The Elder Saturn, one of the 5 highest authorities, had failed, because Luffy escaped Egghead alive, and as punishment for that failure, Imu, the hidden god on the empty throne, reaches out and kills Saturn, kills one of the 5 elders, removes one of the beings the entire series had presented as nearly the top of the world, casually, as discipline, establishing beyond any doubt that Imu sits above even them, that the real final enemy of this pirate adventure is a being who can execute the supposed rulers of the world for making a mistake. The scale of the antagonist snapped fully into place in that instant. Luffy is not, in the end, going to fight another pirate for the title. He is on a collision course with a god who has been hiding behind an empty chair since the beginning of recorded history. That is where the deepest thread of the story sits right now. The science of Vegapunk colliding with the history of the Void Century, the world learning it is drowning, and the hidden emperor stepping out of the shadows for the first time. It is the payoff, beginning at last, of everything planted across 3 decades. The moon murals in a comedy side story, the name Joy Boy on a stone far underwater, the letter D, the empty throne. All of it is converging. Before we step back out of the world, I want to take you up, because for all the time the story spends far below the waves and buried in the past, some of its strangest lore lives in the sky, and it is exactly the lore that rewards a wandering mind. There are islands above the clouds. Not floating rocks exactly, but seas of cloud dense enough to stand on, with their own islands and their own peoples, reachable only by chance, usually by riding a violent column of water called a knock-up stream that blasts a ship thousands of meters straight up into the air. Most people on the ocean below do not even believe the sky islands are real. They are a rumor, a sailor's tall tale, until you are standing on a cloud looking down through a hole at the blue world far beneath. Up there, the crew found a place called Skypia, ruled by a man who called himself God. His name was Enel, and he is one of the early villains people remember best, precisely because his power seemed absolute. Enel ate a logia fruit, the rumble fruit, which let him become and control lightning, and a man made of lightning, in a world where most people cannot touch him and he can strike anywhere at the speed of a thunderbolt, is close to a god in practice. He could hear everything on his island through an advanced sixth sense, strike down anyone who defied him, and he ruled through terror while planning to abandon the sky entirely. And here is the lovely mechanical joke of his defeat, the reason his invincibility failed. Enel is lightning, and the one person on the island he could not electrocute was the boy made of rubber, because rubber does not conduct. The god of lightning was undone by the silliest property of Luffy's power, the fact that rubber is an insulator. The story set up an unbeatable logia, and then beat him with grade school physics, which is Oda in a nutshell. Deadly serious world building, resolved by a joke that also happens to be true. Underneath Skypia's conflict is a sadness that connects straight to the buried history we talked about earlier. The sky is home to more than one people, and they had been at war for 400 years over a patch of Holy Land, a war that traces back to a golden city called Shandora, the ruin modeled on the Maya pyramids, whose people were blasted into the sky long ago and never stopped grieving the home they lost. It is another of the story's quiet arguments, that a war can outlive every person who knew what it was originally about, that 4 centuries of blood can be spent over a misunderstanding no one alive remembers the start of. And the deepest layer of it, the one that connects the sky to the moon, is the revelation, seated in that comedy side story about Enel that I mentioned much earlier, that the ancestors of the sky peoples did not come from the sky at all, they came from the moon. Ancient murals show that a civilization once lived on the moon, and when its resources ran dry, they descended to the blue planet, leaving their mechanical servants behind, migrating down to a world that would eventually forget it had ever looked up. That thread, planted in the margins as a joke, is now bound into the deepest science of the final saga, the study of the void century and the ancient kingdom, and the true history of everything. The world keeps going in every direction, is the point. Down, 10,000 meters, to a kingdom in the dark. Up, past the clouds, to islands and the memory of the moon. Back, 800 years, into a century no one may name. And out, to the current frontier, the giant's country of Elbaf, named by reversing an old word for a story, and whose myths lean hard on the Norse, on bound gods and world trees, and the promise of a final battle. Everywhere the crew sails, there is more world underneath the world, another buried people, another forgotten grief, another thread waiting decades to be pulled. That density, that sense that every horizon has something real behind it, is the reason people give this story years of their lives. And remarkably, given how enormous it has all become, the machine that actually produces it week after week has its own history, its own crises, and its own quiet heroes. And that is where I want to bring us in for a landing. The anime began in 1999, produced by Toei Animation, and its first stretch, more than 270 episodes of it, was overseen by a series director named Konosuke Uda, with the very first episode scripted by a writer named Junki Takegami. That anime has now run for more than 1,100 episodes, well over 1,150 of them, an almost unbroken weekly presence for more than a quarter of a century, which makes it one of the longest-running animated series in the world. And through all of it, across every single one of those episodes, one voice has never changed. The actress Mayumi Tanaka has voiced Luffy continuously since the anime's debut in October of 1999. The same performer, for more than 25 years, has been the voice of that boy. She has said that she wants Luffy to be her final role, the one she retires on. And if you know your anime history, you already know her, because she has also voiced Krillin in Dragon Ball since 1986. One woman has been giving voice to two of the best-loved characters in the medium for the better part of 4 decades. The anime has a reputation, and it is worth being honest about it, because a lot of viewers who love the manga struggle with the show, and the reason is padding. For most of its run, Toei produced roughly 1 chapter of manga per weekly episode, which sounds reasonable until you realize how little actually happens, in terms of pure plot, in a single chapter. The result is an anime that can feel agonizingly slow, where a fight that takes a few minutes to read stretches across weeks of television, thick with recaps and held reaction shots and slow motion. The Dressrosa arc is the number people always cite. It runs a bit over 100 chapters in the manga, and it ballooned to 118 episodes in the anime, something close to 40 hours of television for what is maybe 8 or 10 hours of reading. It is the single biggest reason the fandom so often tells newcomers to read the manga instead, and it is a real structural problem, an anime shackled to a weekly schedule that its source could not always feed. But that same anime, at its best, produces some of the loveliest animation in the medium, and it does it through specific, named artists worth knowing. During the Wano arc, the show underwent a deliberate visual overhaul, drawing on the aesthetics of ukiyo-e, the traditional Japanese woodblock prints, all bold ink washes and stark high-contrast color, under a series director named Tatsuya Nagamine and a character designer named Kanae Higuchi. Suddenly, a show people had written off as slow was producing episodes that looked like moving paintings, and one director in particular became a name fans learned to watch for, a woman named Megumi Ishitani, a graduate of Japan's most prestigious art university, who directed a handful of episodes, including the ones numbered 957, 982, and 1015, and that last one is widely called one of the best animated episodes in the entire history of the series. When people say the One Piece anime went from a punchline about pacing to a real artistic high point, these are the specific people who made that happen. The anime has also never been what people call filler-free, and it is worth being clear about that, because the word filler gets thrown around loosely. To keep from catching up to and overtaking the manga, the show has periodically spun off into original arcs and episodes that Oda did not write, stories that do not exist in the source at all, and some of these are frankly skippable padding. The lore we have spent these hours on, though, all of it, the Void Century and the D and Nika and the ancient weapons, comes from the manga, the canon spine Oda controls directly. It is a useful thing to hold in mind that the anime is an adaptation with its own detours, and that the true architecture of the world lives in the pages. Oda himself softens that line a little, because he runs small illustrated side stories in the corners of his title pages, and the fandom treats these as genuine minor canon. There is a diary following 2 young Marines the crew met early on. There is a running comedy serial about Buggy's crew, and one about the gluttonous King Wapol, and a report from the intelligence agents of the government, and a long globe-trotting series called From the Decks of the World that catches up with dozens of old characters at once. Each of these runs for 20, 30, 40 small installments, tucked into the margins, advancing the lives of the supporting cast while the main story barrels ahead somewhere else. Even the music holds a small record. The very first opening theme of the anime, a bright, driving song called We Are, ran across the first 47 episodes and became the sound of the series for a generation. It was performed by a singer named Hiroshi Kitadani, and he holds the record for the most theme song contributions to One Piece of anyone, having returned to sing for the show 5 separate times across its run. That song, We Are, is one of those pieces of music that an entire global audience associates instantly with a single feeling, the beginning of an adventure, and it has been covered and re-recorded and brought back for anniversaries again and again. There is a change happening to the anime right now that marks the end of an era, and it is worth naming because it reflects both the strain and the ambition of the production. After more than 2 decades of running essentially non-stop, week after week, with only brief breaks, the anime shifted from 2026 to a seasonal format, producing a capped number of episodes per year, something around 26, in concentrated cores rather than an endless weekly grind. The reason is quality. By slowing down, By producing fewer episodes with more care, Toei is trying to close the gap between the show's old reputation for padding and its new reputation for spectacle, and to give the final saga the animation it deserves. It is a bet that a story this important is better served by a smaller number of excellent episodes than an endless stream of ordinary ones. And it changes what it even means to be a weekly One Piece anime viewer after 25 years of it simply always being there. The films are their own phenomenon. For years, the One Piece movies were pleasant, non-essential side stories, until Oda began involving himself directly. He personally wrote the screenplay for the film Strong World, at Toei's request for the 10th anniversary, and oversaw the film after it, which gave those two movies a canonical weight the earlier ones did not have. And then, more recently, the franchise produced a film that rewrote its own commercial ceiling, and I will save the full scale of that for where we are heading. Because the story of how One Piece stopped being merely a huge manga and became one of the largest entertainment properties on the planet is the note I want to end on. The scale of it is difficult to hold in your head, so let me give you the numbers, in words, slowly. One Piece holds the Guinness World Record for the most copies published for a single comic book series by a single author. When Volume 103 came out, in the summer of 2022, the series crossed 500 million copies in print, and it has since gone past 600 million copies in circulation worldwide. To make that number a little more real, consider one slice of it, because from late 1997 to the middle of 2022, more than 416 million copies were published in Japan alone, in just that one country. This is a comic that a single man has been drawing on a sliver of sleep a night, and it has printed more copies than there are people in most nations on Earth. No other comic by a single author has ever come close. The films eventually caught up to that scale. For most of the series' life, the movies were fun, disposable adventures, grossing respectable but modest sums. The film called Z, bringing in a few billion yen. The films called Gold and Stampede in a similar range. And then came One Piece Film Red, which detonated. It grossed close to 32 billion yen, something around $245 million, overtaking the beloved Studio Ghibli classic Howl's Moving Castle to become one of the highest-grossing anime films ever made, and leading Japan's entire box office for its year. A franchise that had been a merchandising and publishing giant suddenly proved it could dominate cinemas too, that the audience was not just readers, but a genuine mass-market crowd willing to fill theaters. Then Hollywood, which has a long and mostly cursed history of adapting anime into live action, did the thing everyone assumed was impossible. Netflix produced a live-action One Piece series, with Oda himself involved as a producer, and instead of the disaster fans braced for, it worked. The first season opened to around 18.5 million views and became the most-watched show on the platform in the second half of its release year, pulling well over 100 million hours of viewing in its first week alone. It did what almost no anime adaptation had ever done, which is satisfy the existing fans while pulling in millions of people who had never read a page, and a second season followed in 2026 to a similarly enormous audience. After decades of anime being mangled in translation, the story that had once been cut by 39 episodes and stripped of its cigarettes finally got a Western adaptation that treated it with respect, and the size of the response showed how hungry the world had become for it. I want to give you two smaller, human details from the fandom, because they say something the sales figures cannot. In an official popularity poll a few years back, a completely minor, near-irrelevant background character named Rockstar somehow placed 36th, ranking above Garp, above Roger, above the crew's own beloved first ship, purely as a fandom in-joke, thousands of people voting for a nobody to see how high they could push him. It is the kind of affectionate mischief that only happens around a story people love enough to play with. And in the global popularity poll running in 2026, something is happening that has never happened before, because in Japan, Zoro is currently outpolling Luffy. If that holds, the swordsman would become the first character ever to beat the protagonist in an official One Piece poll, a quiet sign of how deeply this particular side character has lodged himself in people's hearts after almost 30 years. There is one more human detail, and it is the one I keep coming back to. When Oda finally took a real break in 2023, pausing the manga for about 4 weeks, it was not for a vacation, it was for eye surgery, for astigmatism, and he joked, in his self-deprecating way, that he had been drawing the final saga of his life's work, while effectively seeing double, watching two of every character on the page. Picture that. The man steering the biggest story in comics toward the ending he decided on a quarter of a century ago, hunched at a desk on almost no sleep, drawing the climax of everything through blurred and doubled vision, refusing to stop. That is the person behind all of this. Not a corporation, not an algorithm, not a committee. One stubborn artist who was rejected 3 times, who thought he would be done in 5 years, and who has instead given almost his entire adult life to a story about a boy who wants to be free. And that, in the end, is the thing worth remembering as the lights stay low. If you have stayed with me this long, and I hope you are already drifting, I want to leave you with something gentler than lore. Think about what it actually means for a story to run this long. A person who picked up the first chapter as a child, in the summer of 1997, is now well into middle age, and the story is still going, still arriving week after week, the same voice actor still speaking for the same boy. There are people who have measured out their whole lives against this thing, who read it through school and heartbreak and their first jobs and the births of their own children, who have grown up and grown older alongside a crew that barely ages at all. That is a rare relationship to have with a piece of art, closer to the way people live alongside a long marriage or a hometown than the way we usually consume entertainment. One Piece has been a fixed point in an enormous number of lives, a thing that was there last year and the year before, and will, for a little while longer, be there next year too. And I think that is the real reason lore like this makes such good company at the end of a day. It is not the fights or the twists, exciting as they are. It is the sheer density of a world that someone has cared about, in detail, for almost 30 years. Every island has a real place behind it. Every villain has a face borrowed from an actor or a musician the author loved. Every throwaway character has a nationality and a smell and a job he would hold if he were real. There is a wholeness to it, a feeling that even the corners you cannot see are filled in, that nothing is cardboard, that if you turned any prop over, there would be something written on the back. That kind of completeness is soothing in a way that is hard to put a finger on. It tells the tired part of your mind that somewhere, someone built a world carefully enough that it holds together, that the loose threads are not loose at all, just waiting, that a name dropped in passing hundreds of chapters ago was always going to matter. In a life that mostly does not resolve its own loose ends, there is a deep comfort in a story that promises, and keeps promising, that all of it connects. The ending is coming, in the next few years, the ending the author drew before most of us knew the story existed. When it arrives, it will be one of the largest shared moments popular culture has ever had. Millions of people who have waited decades finally learning what a laughing crew found at the end of the world, what the letter carried, what the treasure was. And whatever it turns out to be, it will not really be about the gold, because the man who made it told us plainly that he hates the idea of the treasure being a metaphor, that it is a real thing, and yet the whole shape of the story he built argues, underneath his own words, that the reaching mattered as much as the thing reached for. Both can be true. There is a treasure, and it is real, and the journey to it was the point anyway. That is not a contradiction the story needs to resolve. It is the tension it runs on. So let that be where we rest tonight. A boy in a borrowed hat, sailing toward an island at the end of the sea, carrying a dream handed down from a dead king, on a voyage that has already outlasted so much and will, before long, finally arrive. You do not need to remember any of the names. You do not need to hold on to a single fact from the last couple of hours. Let it all go soft and blur together, the seas and the fruits and the buried century, the giants and the sky islands and the god behind the empty throne, and let the sound of it carry you the rest of the way down into sleep. The world will keep going without you for a few hours. The crew will still be sailing when you wake up. Thank you for spending this quiet stretch of the night here with Mary. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.